Hello, and welcome to Spotlight, here live on Grapple Patreon. I'm Benno.
I'm JP.
And I'm Will.
And joining us, it's the one and only Will Cooling. We've gone full work setup from working from home setup here, Will. Full laptop, full HD camera. Good to have you. We've normally got you smoking on the couch on our live crappy hours, where you basically come in and out of the feed as I throw you out or bring you back, depending on where we're up to with the that bit. Although the cigar is there, so yeah, good to see.
The cigar is there.
Good to have you on, mate. How's it going?
Yeah, no, it's been good. It's been good. Since I appeared on the fantasy football show, my draft league has gone horribly wrong. So I think that's punishment on me for my nonsense that day. But no, fine. No, glad to be on.
Usually got you in the chat giving us grief, pretty much, haven't we? So that's you have to pick us up on things, won't he, JP? But yeah, of course, we come to you live on our Patreon, live with our YouTube members as well. I'll get the plugs out the way quickly because we have got a lot to get into. Obviously, got Will here to talk the Mr. McMahon documentary on Netflix, and we'll go through some news towards the end as well. Rey Fenix contract and some other stuff as well. But yeah, we'll blow it out the way first. JP, how are you getting on with your homework? Platt saying here in the chat, you've got yours done, Will. If you missed it on the Patreon this week, Randy Orton was announced as Matty's next Dealer's Choice show. The only one way to follow up, Nigel, wasn't it, with a bit of Randall. So hope for I haven't started, if I'm honest, but I hope everyone else has got going with the homework.
I haven't started, mate. There's potentially a gap tomorrow where I can see myself sat down going, right, let's just play our way through this and hope for the absolute best. I can't. I can't. There's a part of me that just couldn't face it. And I was thinking to myself, oh God. And then I just think, well, fuck it. Just might have to tuck into that 4-hour-long playlist. Just go completely balls deep in it. To use a terrible expression. But yeah, I'm fearing the worst. But I am open-minded enough to be pleasantly surprised. I'm not expecting that to happen, but you know.
No. I think we've braced everybody for what it's going to be. It's a long playlist, I will say, but Matty has narrowed it down now. We've apparently got him down a couple him hitting the RKO on Matt Seidel turned out to not be as much watch as Matty first thought when he put this playlist together. That's the problem when you put the power of such in the hands of Matty and our Connor. So yeah, they've done a good job. There's a good playlist out there. I can't imagine many of our patrons are gonna work their way through it, but. Don't know. Any fond memories of Randy Orton's wrestling career? Will,
to be honest, my homework after this is to watch that Four Kings documentary on Amazon Prime that Liam and Martin were banging on about, because that seems proper good. That seems like something pretty special.
Yeah, it's a better way to spend your week, I would probably say. To be honest, I much preferred that to the documentary we're about to talk about today in a few different ways. Well, and I know fuck all about boxing. I want that to happen. You, Liam, Martin Bushby, Great Bash Heel. That's the truth for Four Kings. Can we get a podcast out here? They're trying to in the background maneuver that to make it happen, like a special episode of Time or something, or the return of the British Wrestling Report. Maybe we could call it that. I don't know.
Well, yeah, that'd be before I really watched a lot of boxing, so I wouldn't claim to be an expert of that era. But I remember watching World in Action, the old ITV version of Panorama, when it was all about should boxing be banned after what happened in the Ben Buchanan fights. So, yeah, no, I think it'd be a good documentary. So it'd be a good discussion to have. So we'll try and make it happen.
That's it. Every thought I'd be begging for a boxing podcast, but sure we can find a way. We cover everything here. Obviously, yeah, we'll have Randy Orton coming up. Nigel is out there for anybody who hasn't heard of it. Still good evergreen content, even post the Wednesday match, which I think we were absolutely right about. Jamie, we talked that on the weekend show as well. But yeah, Nigel is out there still for watching. I would so. Getting the rave reviews from no less than some luminaries in podcasting who very much enjoyed it. And yeah, I think for me one of the highlights I think of I don't know what YouTube's trying to suggest to us there on the Grapple YouTube, but one of the highlights of my podcast, and I would say, and a show that I wanted to do a long time, and was it a labour of love, but Very much worth that labour. It's up for YouTube members. It's up for patrons. We actually had some of the you can actually buy the shows on pay-per-view on Patreon now. I think it's £3, something like that. You can just get the Nigel show. Why would you though, JP, when you can get everything else we've talked about? But yeah, I definitely have it up there with one of the very best of the shows we've ever done. And that's me saying it, but I absolutely mean it as well. Always love going down that. To be honest, it wasn't so much me. It was more Gareth. Just hearing Gareth sit there and break down these Nigel matches and fall in love with the wrestler in real time was worth the price of admission for me.
Oh, I'm completely with you on this in terms of it was brilliant hearing, like, because obviously the way that and I think it's up there with some of the best stuff we've done because of just the nature of the playlist, the amount of like just different aspects of Nigel and Nigel's career that we go into as well, even the sort of the post-career side of it. But like I say, just hearing Gareth breaking down his matches, because I struggle to think of anyone who does it better within the podcasting realm. And yeah, just being able to sort of sit there front row ringside for that, it was just fantastic. But that was great fun. But then as we've seen, we've gone from the Yes movement then to the lows of the Bam Bam Bigelow mixtape to the highs then of Nigel. And then you're seeing Randy Orton, and it's hard not to think that the direction of travel is in one direction. And and it's but again, it'll be brilliant for that.
Any more love for Nigel than Randy? Will? Is that a moment of history you're fully on board with?
No, because I never really got into Ring of Honor at the time, which is why I haven't had a chance to listen to the Nigel one yet. But it's why I love this great continuing series of Benno gets Gareth to watch classic Ring of Honor, because it is such a good window into that time, and it encourages us to watch the playlist. You get to see Gareth's thoughts, your memories. So like, I'm going to catch up on Nigel, but I remember the one you did on Samoa Joe and listening to that on the way down to your call a couple of years ago, and that was just one of the best you've ever done. So I'm looking forward to catching up on this.
Oh, nice one. Appreciate it. And yeah, it's always, we got a little selection now of ROH retro stuff in there. Not all of them features me in the front row, but a fair amount does, actually, strangely. Mikey says there, very much enjoyed the match with the concussion stipulation with Nigel and Brian. That was great hearing Garrett's breakdown of. Apparently, we're getting Matty's breakdown of that on the pre-show coming up if you want any more plugs, because he didn't manage to fit that in. So I'm excited to hear that as well. But yeah, it's definitely a labour of love, and it's something we will continue. We'll put it under a name, as the chat says there, the Gareth approval series. Simon says maybe there's something in that as I look upwards to try and get Gareth to enjoy what I enjoy. It's weird the way I'm showing him all the good stuff, though. I'm not exactly showing him like the Christopher Street connection, or as much as I loved it, Special K and Brian XL and all of that stuff from the early 2000s. Only the cream of the crop you get in the Gareth approval series. But yeah, it won him over this time, so I was very, very proud of that. And obviously that was the great segue into what we talked about on Weekend Show this week, which was the Brian and Nigel match on Wednesday, which was genuinely, I would say, good. Not great, but good, and way better than it had any right to be. So it was a great little setup for that. We'll maybe talk a little bit more about that later, but you can get our thoughts on that on the Weekend Show as well. But is that everything plug-wise, JP? Anything else?
Well, there's always, as we'll always go to, and I'm just about to bring it up there on the screen as well. If you go to Chopped-Tees, you'll always find that's where our merch is these days as well. There's you've got your classic tees, the pink retro one, which is very popular, the grapple cap, which you're wearing as well, not the flex fit cap, the snapback. That's how you operate, mate. For that as well.
Pandemic's got a lot to answer for. Beards and hats. You need to get you on the hat train, Will. As a man with a great beard.
Considering we're talking about a Ringer-produced documentary series, I'm wearing the Grapple Ringer tee in celebration of that as well. I should say as well, all of the prices include P&P. It includes any taxes on there, so there's no hidden costs that come into the mix. What you see is what you pay, and again, really good quality stuff. So yeah, we've got absolutely loads of stuff on there. And then if you wanted some of the older T-shirts that we have, or Gareth's got he's got them up on the grapple.bigcartel.com page as well. The low price of £6 as well. So I would say get yourself over to both of those places.
Can't get a Primark t-shirt that cheap, you know, and I try as a fan of black t-shirts. I say Matalan are a slight level above Primark, but I do own a good few Primark ones, to be fair. But yeah, definitely get them from Gareth if you're gonna get them anywhere, and we'll get you all head to toe. We'll have to get you some grapple merch. We'll have to get you one of those retro hats or something like that. We'll sort it out. Listeners to Retro Bite Up, by the way, Spotify bugged out this afternoon, and it for about an hour Spotify was down, and the draft new edition of Retro might well have been available weirdly. I don't know what went wrong. So if you're one of the 11 people who managed to download that, you got an early copy. But if you really want early access, that'll be on the Patreon in the coming days as well. But yeah, on that note, we should get into what we've got you on for this week. Will we get you on for all the fun subjects? It's been a long time coming having you back on. I'm pretty sure the last time we had you on a spotlight was around a Vince story or something developing in the Janel Grant case. So we always like to have you on for this obviously very serious subject matter, and talking about the rewatching, as much fun as watching Nigel back was last week, and as much not fun the Orton homework's about to be. Don't even know how I'd qualify the Mr. McMahon homework over this week. Obviously, time of recording the weekend show. Me and JP had seen a little bit of it. I'd seen a couple of episodes. I've kind of been watching along on Twitter, Will, as you've been watching it through, and adding to our group chat, doing a little bit of outside extracurricular homework for it as well, book review wise as well. But yeah, time of weekend show, I was very much like, these first two episodes have been pretty all right. I don't really see what everyone's complaining about. Got to episode 3 and 4, fully understood what everyone was complaining about. And then got to episode 5 and 6, and maybe had a slightly different take as well at the end of it. But I gather from speaking to you a little bit, Will, that was maybe your experience of it. I mean, it's a loaded question, but was it an enjoyable watch as far as watching the documentary series?
No, it was an enjoyable watch. It's a perfectly fine documentary. I think one thing I don't think has been talked about enough is clearly this has been a very troubled production. Mm-hmm. So, obviously they say on the show, Vince cancels his last set of interviews. Mm. And so if you think about a really glaring absence, you basically don't get anything told about the 2010s, presumably because all the interviews with Vince, all the questions on that they had lined up, just never happened. To me, one of the things I was really struck by, and I don't know if you guys saw this, the talking heads were a bit lacking. I thought, it's Netflix. They're going to get so many guys out of the woodwork. Other than Bob Costas, Bonnie Hammer from USA Network, I think this is sub-WWE level of talking heads. I think WWE get more people for their documentaries. But, potted history of WWE, it was all right.
How
about you, JP? How did you find the watching through?
Yeah, it's a funny one, really, isn't it? Because I think I'd kind of more by the time I'd actually finished it off, I was really conflicted in how I felt, and I made sure.
You are a man who likes a serial killer documentary. You should put that out there first as well.
I love a Netflix documentary as well, and as much true crime as possible. And this can easily fall under the banner of true crime, really, can't it? The thing I found about this was I came away thinking, and it almost was confirmed by Bill Simmons and David Schumacher when they were talking about this on the Ringer podcast as well, is this really wasn't aimed at the likes of us. This was something that when it came in place, and they said it themselves, they said they were going to find it impossible to please everyone. It was never going to be, doesn't have the element of detail or any surprises that we would have wanted ourselves as hardcore wrestling fans, while simultaneously it needing to be kind of broad enough to try and get in the mythical casual fan. In this case, we speak about them, and this is something that seems very much aimed at them, and about creating. It feels like it's there really to create a primer for the WWE on Netflix. It's just the perfect kind of lead up to that. But yeah, it's a strange documentary because I would say it's incredibly watchable, but watchable isn't always good. You can watch things simply because it's wrestling content, it's wrestling documentary produced with a slick sheen to it, but not perhaps with that sort of that real what do we learn that's new from it, as we'll get into when we get deep into the weeds on it.
Yeah, and I know you were saying that from weeks out of it, that's probably the expectation level that they're going to have to try and please all audiences, and we're going to be the audience that's most difficult to kind of please. And I think I agree with that. While still, I want to hit the documentary over the head for some of the things that, from more informed people like us would very clearly say was lacking, and that goes from talking heads as Will, as you said, then Will, to just the way they cover some of the subject matter in this. Like, one of my immediate big takeaways, like I say, when I was 2 episodes in, was thinking, I'm enjoying this. Looking forward to the time they're going to spend on other subjects, and getting into episodes 3 and 4 and going, hang on, we just spent pretty much an hour on the Attitude Era. We're doing an hour on WCW, are we? In the Montreal Screwjob involved in over those 2 episodes, and then hang on, I got to the last episode and I was like, whoa, there's 25 minutes left here. Are we now finally getting to the Janel Grant situation? And that speaks to my broader problem with it, which is just the length of it. It's the fact that it's 6 episodes, and the fact that it is trying to be all things to all people. But you just can't, I don't think, across the runtime of this, cover everything you want to cover, or at least go in depth on Vince McMahon. But even saying that, I still think, that there was a lot of time spent on superfluous stuff, like, the Monday Night War, like I mentioned, and just generally the oral history of WWE or the wrestling business in general was given a lot of time that could have, been deeper diving on Vince subjects. That's probably where my criticism mainly lies, Will.
They had no hook. Now, if you think about what is the elevator pitch for this documentary, and it is basically potted history of WWE. And I think it's difficult, because how do you tell the story of Vince McMahon without telling what WWE is? Because of, your casual audience. And I think episode 5 actually stumbles on what the answer should have been, which is you really lean into the family stuff. And it's almost, you go through Vince's relationships with his family, so you go into his relationship with his dad, you go into his relationship with Bret Hart as like a kind of a make-believe son, then Shane, then Steph, then Triple H, then his wife at the end, and that's your segue into Janel Grant stuff. And I think that would work for your casual audience, because it's like, how did this family business come to dominate this multinational industry, this multinational art form? But because they didn't do that, and because really only Shane was willing to be really open about his relationship with his dad, Steph, Linda, even Triple H were very reserved, very careful about what they'd say about Vince. That family stuff never really came alive. Even the stuff about his dad was very spare and had loads of stuff missing.
Yeah, and that's, I think, as the documentary filmmakers have kind of come out, a lot of the difficulty there lies with Vince, lies with getting Vince to actually open up on those subjects. But even then, it's very bare bones, because that was it. That was, when I say I was enjoying it early, it was because I was enjoying that background view. I was enjoying them actually going over the relationship with his dad, and the thing that's mentioned but isn't really delved into is obviously the allegations possibly against his mum, which Vince has alluded to over the years. And then, like you say, the later stuff with Shane and Stephanie and that dynamic, like, that was quite, I had a tear in my eye at one point, during the Shane and Vince stuff later on. Like, I think I agree with Will, JP, that was actually your way in a lot of ways.
Oh, I think absolutely. I think and it's a shame, because my thought was with this is, it's like, wouldn't it have been good if, and unfortunately he isn't there, the only other person who can kind of corroborate any aspects of this would have been his brother, Rod, but obviously he passed away. So the problem is, at the center of this, you've got someone here who's talking about their relationship with the family, but they're the most unreliable of narrators. Whether it because he simply, he thinks what he believes is the truth. That's a common theme throughout all of this as well. But it's also the first time that you kind of get like an emotional hook. Because really, like you mentioned about episodes 3 and 4, the problem I had was, it was just like, well, there's any number of documentaries you could watch that cover this exact same subject in exactly the same way, with the same talking heads, saying the same kind of stuff. Dare I say, I think Who Killed WCW had better talking heads for the most part, more interesting ones from different kind of realms. And we, when it went to the family perspective, you were thinking, oh, okay, this is there's even more stuff that they could have really gone into with that, because you need that emotional hook in order to kind of create that proper level of investment. Otherwise, it's a series of, like you say, a potted history of WWF/WWE, which is intriguing. And I know people who've watched this who aren't fans, or they were fans when they were kids, and they've enjoyed the nostalgia part. But that's really what it is. It's like, oh, I remember this. This was a big deal when I was a kid. And then sort of just like, but they couldn't have really cared. And I think if you want to make like documentaries that are going to really appeal, you do need to have that kind of like emotional attachment. And it was only really, like you say, with Shane, that's the one time. And perhaps maybe I had in my head, and this guy might well be ended up going to the competitor who they barely, they mention in very much broad passing strokes at the end.
One image of Dynamite, don't you? And that's it.
Yeah.
An hour on WWE, which speaks to the problem these type of documentaries have. But to your point, JP, what you described there sounds like a WWE documentary, a WWE Network documentary, which therein lies the problem with this, I think, a lot of the way. Because that's pretty much what it is, for a big chunk of it, but not by accident. By design. This is, something Vince McMahon and WWE were very involved in the production of, at least at the start, until the rights were sold on. And I think it's a big talking point, the idea of the story change while we were making it, and then that's obvious in episode 1, and the last episodes are the ones where the tweaks are, and in the middle is where there isn't much of a change, and that's all very apparent. But it kind of speaks to the problem, I'd say. Well, what were they planning on doing in the first place? Was it just that? Because that's what it comes off as. Yeah. A just typical Cody playing Miz WWE documentary where it's like, oh, wasn't the Monday Night Wars tough? Or remember when, Mick Foley and The Rock did This Is Their Life segments, and remember the streak? And it goes into the streak, and it goes into ruthless aggression. Despite the real life story that should be, that the biggest issue with this, that really the whole documentary could have been. The story they went into to tell in the first place, I think, isn't getting enough criticism in circles, I'd say, Will, because was that really the plan to do what we saw in those middle episodes?
Yeah, but firstly, I thought Cody was abysmal in this.
Awful.
He really needs to wind his neck in. He came
Sports entertainment came out of his lips way too many times. Again, gives you an indication of what this was designed to be.
And he was just talking about stuff he clearly wasn't an authority on. He looked like a geek. I think it's, not to make a Matty point, I think it's very noticeable that Roman Reigns was nowhere near this. And I'm sure Heyman told him, no, don't do this. No, this is not going to make you look good. I think part of the issue is, and with the ruthless aggression stuff, on the one level, they handled some of that quite well, in the sense of they got at this idea of Vince is just like this gorilla stampaging around the TV, picking on mid-carders, exploiting women, abusing talent who can't stand up to him. But they're also spending so much time on, say, John Cena, when clearly Vince had nothing to do with John Cena. The stuff with his relationship with Hogan, or his relationship with Bret, or his relationship with Austin, that is interesting because Vince has a role, a key role in developing those characters and making them stars. Cena's something that really did fall on his lap. He's a more distant figure due to the restructuring. And so it's why is this here? This has nothing to do with Mr. McMahon. This has nothing to do with Vince. And again, it comes back at the very end. They go to several of the wrestlers and say, "What is Vince's legacy?" And none of them can answer it. But nor can the documentary. The documentary doesn't have an answer on what Vince's legacy is. And so it's stuck with these platitudes. It's at the very beginning they talk about wrestling is Americana, wrestling's Americana. But then they start talking about how wrestling was organized on a regional basis. Well, that means wrestling wasn't Americana in the 70s, 80s, because it wasn't American wrestling. It was Northeastern wrestling, Southern wrestling, Midwest wrestling, Texas wrestling, Western wrestling, Canadian wrestling. Now, you could have said, okay, Vince is the one that makes it Americana. Vince is the one that gives you this unified vision of American wrestling. But you have to tell that story, and it doesn't.
That lies again, with the problems with it a lot. And like you said, JP, the difference between this being good and me enjoying it are different, because there were elements of this that I did enjoy. But to that point, too many people, Vince being the main one, are allowed to just say things on this documentary unchallenged. Too many things made the final cut of this that, like, hang on, that doesn't pass the smell test. Hang on, really? Is that really not something if we dig into it? Or there were a few, wasn't there? Like Meltzer was an MVP of this. You know, Meltzer talk about the talking heads. Meltzer being there, being able to be that fact checker in a lot of cases was great. But then there's other parts where it's like, you know, you're letting Vince tell the story of, you know, what happened with WrestleMania 7 and the build between Hogan and Slaughter, and nobody here is mentioning the very fact that, you know, they had to move venues, and that they put a bullshit story out about, you know, a bomb threat or whatever it was, and they're allowing Vince to kind of tell that story without really much pushback, and there's dotted examples throughout this for me, JP.
Oh, there is, and I think part of the problem with that actually comes down to the filmmaker himself, to the director, and that's Chris Smith. And it's only his fault in the sense that he wasn't a wrestling fan. And I was listening to, like, when Bill Simmons and David Schumacher, who's like one of the consultant producers, clearly that's the historian of choice that they kind of went with, and they were talking about that, and they were saying he didn't really know. So he clearly also doesn't realize that he's being kind of worked for the most part, and he's having to accept what's going on, and there isn't enough people. Like, it's sparingly Dave Meltzer's allowed to do this. And I think when you mentioned about like ruthless aggression and things like that, it's like, well, there's a bigger conversation about like the downturn in business, sort of post invasion, post the buyouts, how the company kind of falls into a lull for a very long time, and it's just these
creatively
enormous,
even.
Yeah, creatively, these TV rights deals are the things that are kind of, it's got value as as a content provider, but very little else. And it's a struggle. And they kind of like completely gloss over that period of time just to sort of jump to the bit of, oh, by the way, now it's more popular than ever. Or like it's got like it's more profitable than ever. And it's like, okay, there's so much there that's in between that you could kind of question of like, well, you know, anybody who was like sort of had really done their research into it, you'd have been able to go, well, like, you look at these TV ratings are here, they're down at this stage, now they're down to this level. What do you think is the reason for that downturn? And at least asking the question. Now, I know that's kind of a loaded question, and there is kind of answers in the birth of streaming services and whatnot. But even things like the WWE Network, they talk about that being, well, a big success it is. And it's like, well, is it really? It was a big success when they sold it all to Peacock. They got an enormous amount of money from it.
Yeah,
but in the main, it never hit the projected figures that they wanted. It didn't even. I don't think.
There's a reason they sold to Peacock. There's a reason they completely, you know, changed business strategies and fired, what was her name, Michelle and George Barrios, was it? Like, you got rid of them too. There's a reason all that happens. And again, maybe with this limited time and you're telling this story for layman's in the main, you're going to struggle to get that in. But that could be an episode in itself, couldn't it? That could be, that again, that speaks to the lack of time and the time spent on other things.
In defense of them, if you assume their interviews are going chronologically, maybe that was going to be covered in those last interviews.
Right. And
so they missed it. Because basically they don't touch on anything after John Cena.
Yeah.
So like Roman Reigns isn't talked about.
Oh God, there's an entire decade that isn't. They don't go into. They don't go into the 2010s. That's just not a thing.
Going back to the WrestleMania 7 stuff, that to me, like, again, if you're looking at the psyche of Vince McMahon, that was a real missed opportunity. And then Bob Costas kind of touches upon it, which is like the content gets darker in like around that 90 period. Like, you have the Iraq War stuff, you have, you know, the Undertaker come, you have like things like Papa Shango. Like, Vince is off kilter and what is going on with Vince. And that would have been interesting. Like, why are you doing this? This doesn't seem like the time. No, like Jake the Snake getting his edge back. And it's like, I don't know whether it's because the guy didn't know to ask these questions or because he couldn't get good answers from Vince. But there seemed to not be enough interest in Vince as a creative force. Like, what is going through your mind when you are putting this stuff on?
And I think I also think that's as well when you hear the stories of the actual kind of shoots and which has come out whereby he would keep them waiting around till basically about 11 o'clock. So he'd have the time pushed back where he'd turn up for the interview and then he'd wait till 11 o'clock. And then they said there were hours of footage he couldn't use because his voice is so wrecked at this stage as well. So he said it was like that was unusable. And you think that's a very deliberate ploy on his part to almost like, I'm going to come in, I'm just going to wear you down. And like to the point that when you come in, you're just going to have to accept what I tell you. And they're almost not in a position because you've got to imagine that the filmmakers are waiting around inside like the warehouse or wherever they filmed it with the ring. Just got to wait around all day for this bloke to turn up. And because he is the subject of the documentary, you kind of can't do it without him. And we're never going to get another one of these. We're never going to get another one of these where he's facing the kind of levels of questions and scrutiny that you would hope to get. And it's probably like the lack of follow-ups and things like this. And this is where probably as a documentary filmmaker, what you wanted was someone who'd be more along the lines of like, dare I say, an investigative journalist. Because that's really the kind of perspective you'd want, where you're kind of like really narrowing in on details and going, wait a second, you've said this, but this is very much the case of like, you see it on isolated occasions, like when he, but it's about stuff that ultimately isn't important.
Stuff.
The territory stuff.
Yeah, you squashed all them, but you're talking about big bad Ted Turner coming to you like you're the, and you get a bit of insight there in Vince actually coming back and going, oh well, to be honest, a lot of the things I say are just to put a narrative out there because you know that's what I'm doing. It's not necessarily what I think is the way you worded it, and like I enjoyed that moment because it was good pushback. But I suppose on their end, you can only do that so many times, especially in this environment where you know Vince is there as a friendly, you know, subject. He's still in post while he's being interviewed here. All of the other people who are being interviewed are all people who are currently his employees. Like you even get at one point Jimmy Hart going, "Oh, I don't know what they want me to say." You know what I mean? You've got a lot of that. He says that outright. A lot of other people, it's in the context of what they're saying.
Yeah.
Like I understand that. Yeah, in that it almost makes it a bad time to do this documentary. To be honest, it'd be better if you did it present day. I reckon you would get some people who wouldn't turn up, but you might, and you get a lot less WWE involvement, but you might get more honest answers out of people. But I am sympathetic to that element of like, okay, well, we need to push back. But if we push back on day one and it's about like the, you know, something that happened in 1980s, we're never going to get to the later points that we really want to push back on. And, you know, same with the, you know, with the talent there, they're all looking over the shoulder and they're all worried about their next run in WWE because Vince is still a powerful man at the time of recording this. And there's only so much you can push back on them as well.
And therein, sorry.
Are you good then, JP?
I was going to say, and therein lies the problem, is that wrestlers as talking heads is something. Is it possible to do a wrestling documentary without any wrestlers as talking heads? I'd like to see it in some ways, because I think in many ways they're part of the problem, because there was this element of everyone was too scared to say anything negative about Vince or anything that was kind of critical. So it was the same, like, and again, we've watched all of the other WWE produced documentaries and they said exactly the same. I don't think we learned anything new from, say, someone like
apart from Tony
the Undertaker, apart from Tony Atlas, who doesn't give a shit. Like, that's always the impression you get with him. He doesn't care. And even then, like, and he's not like he completely buries him as well, but like he's at least able to be honest. Whereas the, like, well,
he's not credible, or is he? That's the problem. He's honest, but he's not credible because he's sat there.
Last year he worked.
Yeah.
What was the last year he worked in WWF? Like he's talking about Vince is like this, Vince is like this. Like, have you met him since the 1980s?
Absolutely, yeah, and he's providing that because no one else is, and that's why so much of his footage makes it. But yeah, outside of him, JP, yeah, sorry to interrupt. That's about it, really, isn't it?
That's it, and they're not. And this is the thing. I think this is in some ways what I'd want to see, and I'm thinking about. So recently, I watched. This sounds a bit dark. I watched like a 6-part. There was a 6-part Netflix documentary called Hitler: The Rise of Evil, and like I know all the talking heads on it. It's very much like historians.
No, mate, it's called Mr. McMahon. This, sorry, that was the name they were gonna go with, but they changed it.
Was Fritz there?
But this is the thing about it, is that they're like in that as well. Like it's obviously, I mean, you know, given the time frame and everything else, it's all historians who are talking, but they're people who are slightly removed from the product as well. And I think a documentary like this, where you're looking to see what the influences are, I found it interesting when there was someone, I can't remember her first name. One name's Sharon Mazar, who would occasionally come in as,
near the end, wasn't it mainly?
I wasn't, yeah, near the end mainly, but she would come in and she was talking about like the link about the pro wrestlingification of things like politics and of entertainment and the idea, and we see this with politicians. Trump is obviously the obvious go-to example, but you see it even with Boris Johnson, I would say, where the idea is sell stuff. Sell stuff. You don't admit fault. It's never your fault, and you just ride through catastrophes, and they will just wash off you. And weirdly, people have a kind of admiration of that. There's that bigger picture kind of thinking that the wrestlers themselves aren't going to provide because they're interested in kind of like the here and now, aren't they? And even the people who could provide, and this is where we came, but we said this on the weekend show, where's Jim Ross? Where's Jim Cornette? They are people who, if nothing else, they can provide a historical context, and particularly Jim Ross. If you're going to do so much in and around the Attitude Era, Monday Night Wars, him being there when WWF was at a low ebb in the mid 90s, sort of that tail end of the New Generation era, he's an absolutely crucial voice to have. And it makes you wonder whether or not was he someone who they were just like, well, he actually works for the competition now, so is he going to be as invested? Oh, do we want to hear what he has to say when they, did they have approval
around?
Well,
you said that anyway, though. It's Jim Ross in it.
Probably not.
On dark sides of the ring, like he's still a homer, isn't he? There's still only so much he'll say. You might have got him, but I know what you're saying. You ask him the right questions, something might slip out. But it goes to the wider problem of using wrestling people, doesn't it? I don't think I'd even trust him.
One of the things I thought as well is like, so JP mentioned Donald Trump. Where's Donald Trump? Like, why is he not talking head? Like, I know he'd talk nonsense, but if you're thinking like, we want casual fans, we want people just off the street to come and watch it. An episode on Matt McMahon's Trump's relationship, which they really underplay. Like, I think you see him at WrestleMania 6 or 7 in the background. But why is there no talk of the fact that Trump hosts Mania in 4 and 5 and 9? That that they get him to be the guest host of Raw. So they get him to take over Raw in 2009. Like there's actually they put him in his Hall of Fame. That Linda ends up going into his cabinet. There's a lot of relationship there. Like that could have been the documentary. Adapt the Trump Mania book that Lavi put together, and I think that would have had very much a lot of popular appeal. Likewise, one of the things I thought was really striking, because again, the lack of detail is not just in a pro-Vince direction. It also misses some of the stuff that was trying for Vince. Like, they just gloss over what he does in the 70s, where, like, he's trying to make his bones. He's promoting Evil Knievel. He's promoting Ali, Inoki. He's running some of the minor tier offices in WWF to prove to his father he can do it. Like, that would have been interesting. That would have been a really interesting insight into how Vince got himself in a position to be the guy to run WWF. Because what this basically says is he turns up out of the blue. 10 years later, his dad makes him an announcer. And even then, they don't tell the full story because it's all about union regs and getting around union regs, which is why Vince has made an announcer. So, yeah, it's that lack of detail runs through the whole project. And I don't think it's always to Vince's benefit, because I think sometimes they miss some of the stuff he actually did to become a success.
On that point, I was going to say, JP, what do we think about the way they kind of cover the various controversies through Vince's career? Obviously, Janel Grant's the biggest one, which we'll get to. But like, to Will's point, it's kind of what we've been saying. I wouldn't say any of it's not covered. I think every beat is covered. From the steroid scandal to Tan and Solana allegations to Rita Chatterton to everything in the Ring Boy scandal is given a fair amount of detail. If anything, as bad as Vince looks coming out of this, Pat Patterson is probably one of the big victims of this documentary, and that they're going quite hard on that element of the story. It's all there, isn't it? It's just with varying degrees of depth and detail is the issue.
So I think probably, again, this is like one of it would like set it. So Rita Chatterton's like a kind of a great case in point. It tells you about Rita Chatterton. It then like sort of introduces who she is. Then you go to like her post kind of WWF career where she's talking about the allegations and things with Vince and the rape allegation that she states, and then Vince is like he gets to respond to it. You don't see the follow-up on that, and his response to it is actually one of the more revealing things, because he gives away it's something he says where he says, what is it, he goes, and anyway the statute of limitations is gone.
Yeah,
and you're like, what the fuck?
He says it wasn't rape, but even if it was, the statute of limitations is gone, which tells you like that's a nugget where they got an insight into how his brain works there. I think that, and Rita Chatterton herself, the way she comes across in the historical and more current clips, like I think that's going to have a big effect on the casual audience watching it. Actually, I would have liked more of that.
Yeah, and that's the thing with this, and you find out obviously at the end of that statute of limitations gets rescinded, and that's how they end up reaching a settlement that only happened very, very recently as well.
The New York ruling.
I think this is the issues with, like, part of the problem is that you'll never get you've got a character who doesn't. The idea is he doesn't show regret, and it kind of like you get a very bare bones pop psychology idea about why he doesn't show regret. And quite often, and I think that's when we get into almost like the stuff about the 5th episode where he talks about, how he was as a kid, and it's like, I don't fight fair, I just fight and I win, and that's it. And that kind of like sums up like almost like his attitudes to all of these kind of scandals. It's never his fault, and he's never going to admit it. And that is the way, sadly, that a lot of media figures who are embroiled in all manner of controversies, this is how they deal with things, is you just go, no, you absolutely no sell, to the point where you want to quietly settle out of court. And that's how he kind of operates. So whether it's steroids, whether it's Owen Hart, whether it's Montreal, unionization and things like that, those are things that he's just like, nope, it's not my fault in there as well. Although we do get an interesting, I think the thing about the unionization is interesting is Hogan finally admitting, I was a snake, and I did kind of like shoot this down. I think he's someone who doesn't come across particularly well in
not as bad as he could, though. I've seen Hogan come across worse. Somehow
he has, but he's not willing to be introspective, and therefore you've kind of, the problem is at the heart of all of this is you've got this someone who's, while he's not hostile because he's literally sat down doing the interviews for you, he's very much controlled the conditions of how those interviews take place. He is able to kind of talk in circles around it to the point where you just get the feeling that he would just wear you down. And that's what he hopes to do. And I think the problem is with that is that when it comes to the documentary, that doesn't make for like kind of a substantial documentary piece. And I think that's an area that, if you'd had someone like, I say, like an Alex Gibney, who just recently did one on The Sopranos, and David Chase has done all manner of kind of like figures throughout the world. Like, he is someone who would have been able to like do the, Lance Armstrong and whatnot. He would have been able to do that proper rigorous kind of like investigation. But you're not going to get that with Chris Smith as well. He is like, this is the guy. There's a lot of questions to ask about Tiger King, for example. You're never going to get that on Tiger King because it's very much shiny and glossy, Netflix produced like documentary series. This is what he goes for. It's his stock in trade and has made him an incredibly wealthy man.
But do you make of the coverage of the more earlier allegations, Will? Anything illuminating in either the Ring Boy scandal or the Rita Chatterton stuff that's covered in here? Steroids trial?
Not really. And I think this is just a weakness throughout the entire documentary, which is there's no authorial voice. So it's not like the documentarian is in front of camera. And so there's no one to summarize, and there's no one to link things together. And so repeated, and clearly what they were banking on was Vince just being a more open interviewee, and not necessarily telling the truth, just being more assertive about his case. But Vince is just very defensive and very on the one hand, on the other hand, like he's putting his case forward, but in very crouched defensive tones. And so like repeatedly they have to rely on, cutting between Vince and his accuser, or, the inevitable at the end of the episode, here is what happened to the lawsuits in the end, which almost becomes like a running joke after each episode. And, it leaves you with the kind of thing of, okay, Vince is a bad guy, he probably did bad things, but it doesn't ever kind of push beyond that. I think the one where they kind of are the most interested is the steroids. But I think that's because Vince has more to say. It is very reliant on how willing Vince is to open up. Vince is willing to kind of talk in detail, make his case. If Vince is willing to make his case, then they can bring other people in and have that kind of, by the magic of editing, having that conversation. If Vince is defensive, the whole thing just falls a bit flat.
And it's interesting as well in that case where like that bleeds into the WBF story, and you do at least get some introspection from Vince that like, yeah, maybe this wasn't the time to launch a World Bodybuilding Federation at the time when we're under, you know, federal investigation for steroids and all of that side of things. But it also still doesn't delve into the fact that, well, even if it was in the middle of the 80s, nobody fucking wanted it. It was fucking crap. We watched it back, didn't we, JP, for a podcast at one point. You know, that appealed to nobody other than Vince McMahon himself. And I would have liked to seen a bit of pushback on that side, but at least there was that element of admittance of, you know, at least at the timing of it being off, obviously, amongst all the steroid scandal.
I think like the best line in the entire documentary is at the beginning, and it's from Shane. Where he goes, it's when like his dad gets the rap he wants. Like his, you know, what people think of his dad is actually what Vince wants people to think. And I think you see this with stuff like the territories in the sense of, I think there's a very strong argument that people get it wrong, that Vince killed the territories and that it's just cable, like it was inevitable. You know, we saw with Britain, we saw with Japan, we saw with Australia, that once you get national television, you get national promotions, and that as cable comes online in the 80s, the territory system wasn't going to survive. Like there hadn't been a territory system in the early 50s when wrestling was on network television. The NWA just ran wrestling. As more and more promotions got national television, the territories were going to die. But like Vince clearly doesn't want to make that argument. I mean, Heyman alludes to it in passing, but like Vince wants to go down as the guy who killed the territories, because I think there's a part of Vince that wants to be the bad guy, that he enjoys playing that role. And I think one of the big oversights, and maybe this is a rights issue, how can you tell the story of Mr. McMahon and not touch on the McMemphis stuff? Like they let Eric Bischoff say, Vince stole my idea. It's like Vince had been an evil promoter in '93.
Yeah, true. I hadn't even thought of that.
But they don't want to talk about it.
And I like the little bit of colour you get when you talk about who was Vince's favourite wrestler in the 60s, 70s, the bloke who had
Dr. Jerry Graham.
That's it, yeah. I didn't know that. It's hard to picture Vince as like liking wrestling or liking that type of wrestling, or they lean heavily on, and this could be story because of the time this is recorded, but lean heavily on the fact that Vince was going to go for Dusty right before he went for Hogan as like his guy. And obviously that bleeds into the story they were telling with, you know, with Cody around that time on WWE TV. But that was a bit of a revelation. I'd never really put that together, that would be somebody who appealed to Vince. So we got a little bit of colour there, I'd say, JP.
Oh, we did. I found that like particularly like interesting. I mean, and I think that's why I suppose those first two episodes, like you, when you watch them, you think this is incredibly watchable, and because there's so much distance between that time period as well.
Yeah,
there's so many people
allowed to be more. Yeah, that's probably true.
And there's so much distance that you think, oh, okay, they're able to be a bit more upfront and honest about it. I mean, I found it always interesting they didn't talk about, say. And again, how this comes into the timing issue, but something like Black Saturday would have been an interesting kind of counterpoint of like, actually, this is where he tried to promote in an area that wasn't a WWF stronghold, and it was a disaster, and he ended up having to sell it back, and so that's how you end up with sort of Ted Turner being actively involved in like professional wrestling, like to a certain degree. That's where, you know, like, but that's something that again, there isn't the time, but there also isn't the inclination of the filmmakers or Vince to go into that, because, you know, he's not interested in being this sympathetic figure. And I think this is probably like the crux of like the issue with the documentary where you've got him saying, I'm nothing like this character of Mr. McMahon. Everybody else, even Bruce Pritchard, is saying, oh yeah, he is. He's very, very close to it. And a lot of them are like, well, it's him, but it's slightly turned up to 11, that old kind of wrestling cliche stuff.
I'll tell you that, but it's bollocks. It's pretty much what Bruce Pritchard says at one point, which is one of his few positive contributions.
But then Vince says the same thing at the end as well. Like Vince does a complete 180 and is like, maybe I am like my character. I don't know. I've lost track.
Which is interesting in light of, like, we talked about it on Weekend Show, you know, Vince coming out and putting that statement on Twitter of like, it's a load of bollocks. This, what they do is they blur the line and they try and pretend I'm like my character. And then, I was watching the final episode today going, hang on, that's exactly, you're saying what you're accusing them of saying. It's actually telling that. And it's also telling that, like, we're sitting here saying they didn't go in hard enough. Whereas, like, that last episode's got, you know, him saying that. It's got Bruce Pritchard saying, oh, he'd seen the rough cut, hadn't he, so far? He thought it was a complete hatchet job. I mean, to the point when he says that, everything I'd seen before, it was like, fucking hell, Vince is getting off lightly here. Like, this is not a hatchet job in any way, but it, you know, apparently it's enough for that side to believe it is. Like, it's crazy.
I think it's the way they film it, because it almost becomes like a magic eye painting.
Yeah.
So if you love Vince, you can take slight at the editing tricks and how they counterpose things. If you hate Vince, you can look at it and think he's getting off lightly. Like, it's almost designed to please nobody, because it is so not making a call. It is not making a decision about what it thinks of Vince.
That's it. Even things like, say, Jimmy Snooker and any alleged involvement in that.
A gangs would have been a whole episode.
completely glossed over. And I think this is... Like, this is the point. I know we brought this up on the Weekend Show as well, and it always bothered me throughout. It's this idea that comes, well, you weren't being objective, you're taking shots, to which Bruce Pritchard goes down into a lazy, almost the dirt sheets argument, like, kind of stuff. What, God forbid, some historians tell about it, and the reason for this is, well, he was nice to me, so therefore he's a lovely bloke, the end. Like, that, all of those kind of, like, arguments, they really fall flat, but you haven't got, like, at the center of it, like, you haven't got somebody who's interested in being like a rounded human being, warts and all, even to the point of, like, you know, that the stuff he accepts any culpability on is very minor in the scheme of things. It's things like WBF and XFL. It's like it's very, very slight.
I would have liked a bit more, and I don't know what your take was it on, Will, on the Pat Patterson stuff, like, talking that era, because there's almost you know, there's the side that I think Meltzer's great in this. Meltzer is Meltzer is that for the most part. He's like he's the conscience of kind of this documentary, and they use him well. There's moments where I'd want to hear more from him. And he's another one who, you know, I've got my WWE history from when it comes to the steroid trial, when it comes to, you know, Mel Phillips and all of the Ring Boy stuff in the 80s and into the early 90s. But even there, I feel like the documentary maybe told a slightly different version of that story. Like, I've not really seen a piece go this hard on Pat Patterson, I would say, coming out of that. Like, I think a lot of people's minds might well be changed based on what was offered here on Pat Patterson and his involvement in it. And obviously you get the side of the story of, you know, he wasn't as involved as anybody else, and that's kind of taken on face value. Obviously, you know, it's the Vince McMahon side saying that, where Pat Patterson was extremely valuable to WWF in the 80s and 90s. I would have liked a little bit more of a deep dive on that, because I think if you were watching this casually, I think when Pat Patterson died, I think there were a lot of love and tributes to Pat Patterson, and I think as maybe a smart wrestling fan, then we've gotten that side of the story from Meltzer, who was also close to Pat Patterson, and other people who were close to Pat Patterson, and it's been quite charitable. I think that's actually an example in this documentary where it's nowhere near as charitable as you know, other pieces of media have been.
Yeah, I remember a bit after Patterson died, there was bubblings that the received wisdom was maybe not as uncontested as it had been made out, that maybe Patterson had been misbehaving and had been more involved. And it's a really difficult one, isn't it? Because you're basically being given two extremely plausible stories. One, that there'd be malicious gossip against a gay booker in 90s wrestling. Like, yeah, that sounds reasonable. Two, well, if Pat's got his henchmen who are gay and are abusing people, logic would say that Pat is also not above doing that type of stuff as well. So yeah, I mean, I wasn't convinced by what was in the documentary because it's Tony Atlas, and I just don't think he's a very credible person. It's a Superstar Billy Graham stuff. Like Superstar Billy Graham is the only man who would make me doubt that Hulk Hogan took steroids because I'm just designed to not believe anything Superstar Billy Graham says. But like it was like it. No, they did not treat Vince's line, which Meltzer has treated as true, that it was all an anti-gay witch hunt against Pat.
Yeah, there is. I don't even. I also think as well they completely undersell and don't go into any detail at all, not as far as any I can remember, and about like the importance of his role in the company. Like, is the importance of his role as that, like the creative in the ring, the finish guy. How was the creator of the Royal Rumble and things like that as well? They're not like his level of importance. It's just like he's an executive in the company who's openly gay, and here are these allegations against him and against people who are seen to be like kind of working directly under him as well. And there's. And
totally in the other way as well on the Mel Phillips side of things. I've seen Bix point this out a lot, that Vince is on the record of saying he brought Mel Phillips back and said, as long as you stay away from kids, that runs counter to the narrative that is told in this documentary. That's a pretty big fucking smoking gun, isn't it?
This is where, and this is the thing I've thought when we've been talking about this as well as a note, going how different this documentary series would be with a narrator. Just somebody anchoring the story and just sort of saying, okay, these are the next bits, and at least having that into the mix. Because, and you said this earlier on, when you don't have that, you're relying really on like Vince is the narrator, and he's the most unreliable narrator of all. I think even just through just not being able to kind of remember stuff. And the Mel Phillips one is a perfect example of it. I mean, at least they gave kind of, I suppose, I won't say at least they covered it. They kind of had to obviously cover it as well. But there's so much more that you would kind of like want from this as well. And I always thought it was interesting when he said that he thought he was the all-conquering hero. Like in his mind, he was the all-conquering hero after defeating the federal government, and they weren't able to charge him. But it's like, yeah, but by no way you were innocent. The idea, I think there's a one point in episode 2, he says, well, we were a drug-free company. And it's like what you really would have wanted is the interviewer off camera to just start laughing and just go, fuck off. Drug free.
Like he does when he tries to do the drug free speech and then pulls a face. I love that footage, by the way. There was some good footage like that covered in there. But yeah, along those lines, like it's very very revealing as well. That like his attitude towards the FBI and federal government in general, just to me, it seems to be they pick on the little guys, and luckily I was able to fight them, and most people don't. They just come after people, these witch hunts, with false allegations. It's just that they're in the air. Again, very Trumpian, isn't it? But that's the business they're in, according to Vince. Also telling.
It's very Weinstein as well. It's like all of those big figures who are mired in so much controversy. It's this, and that's the problem. That is ultimately what you're up against. Is that you've got somebody who's actively going to block you from ever kind of knowing the truth. But then it's the job of the filmmakers to do the investigation, to kind of actually go to the viewer. Well, these are all of the bits of evidence. And I think the only time when I know Brice Pritchard talked about like kind of, and McMahon in his statement said he talked about like the kind of the sneaky editing. The only time is he's like, I'm not a rapist, and then there's a line where he's end up talking about this. We didn't use guns, and then you see Pillman pulling the gun out against Austin and stuff like that. That's the only time. I think that, and the quotes. I don't
remember the Sable lawsuit, and then they show SmackDown where they made it into a storyline 3 weeks after she came back.
They also do it over WrestleMania 3's attendance as well, which could not give a shit about.
Even Meltzer left it out of the Observer this week, didn't he? He was like, I'm not even doing that again. I've done it enough.
One thing on the steroid trial, and I as Benno mentioned, I've been rereading this, which is Sex, Lies and Headlocks, really good book from about 20 years ago. Actually has some of the same weaknesses as a documentary, in the sense of it says it's about Vince, it becomes a potted history of pro wrestling, but with like a clearer a clearer angle. But like one of the things this makes a point of is the reason why they got off, like Vince got off, is they never directly employed Zahorian. And the only reason that happened is because Linda McMahon got a tip off from somebody to drop him. So why wasn't Linda McMahon asked about that in this documentary?
Yeah.
Like
the
you
fact
have
that even
her.
had is great in it. There's a positive that they've got her sat there. I was surprised. I didn't expect to see her sat there. His wife at the time.
Dave Meltzer was talking. That's the other thing as well. Is if you didn't know anything about it, you would think as a family unit, they're all still kind of close and together. And
what's the status of your current relationship? Are you currently married? Ask him directly. That's a question, isn't it? Like, what's the situation?
Because again, like you say, that like if you think of like that kind of like emotional hook, it's the family. Well, what's the relationship with Linda? What's the relationship with Shane and the shares? You've got Stephanie there at the end resigning. What's the reasoning behind like that stuff that you think, no, we need more? Either you take more time to kind of do this. And it's not the first time a documentary has been derailed by true life events. Probably the most famous example of it, and I don't know if you guys have ever seen it, but a documentary called Capturing the Freedmans out a long time ago. Even like Angie Jarecki will come on to, because the Jinx is very similar, whereby that was taking a certain path and then that gets taken over into the other directions. But the filmmakers go with it and they're able to follow it. Capturing the Freedmans nominally was about New York clowns. Then there's a story from one of the clowns in terms, like one of the guys he's interviewing, who then tells a story about his family and his father and his brother, who are like kind of thought of as being like involved in child abuse. And there's all of these questions that come about, and you don't really ever know the answers to it. But it goes in a completely opposite direction to what they're setting out to do. But I think that's the job of it, is like you follow this stuff. And I think it's like there's almost like an episode I wanted just called Shane, because it's the idea of this prodigal son who you think is being set up. And it does do it to a certain degree, but it does it in a WWE way. And it has to kind of do what is a typical WWE documentary trick of, well, we're going to tie it up with a nice bow that he gave me a hug after WrestleMania 32. And you're like, yeah, I don't know if that's good enough, lads. Like, that's not really like, I don't think that gives us enough.
And I think as well, like, if you know a bit more about the details of what Shane wanted to do, so much of what Shane wanted to do with like ECW or international expansion is actually what Triple H does in the 2010s. So like you actually have this interesting contrast between Shane and Triple H, you know, what is going on there.
He originally wanted NXT Europe, didn't he? Remember those WWE Europe like rumors in like what 2007 or so? Like I remember that.
Wanted ECW to be a show online, like NXT becomes. And I think Steph put it really well on Twitter, which is, you know, one of the lessons of this documentary is like, fathers, please tell your children you love them, because you know there is so much like father-son angst in this documentary. One of the things I think is really interesting is Vince sets himself up as like Bret, Undertaker, Shawn's pretend father figure. He's not that much older than them. Like he's only like 10 years older than those guys. Like they're actually his contemporaries. What's interesting is the Attitude Era people. So like Triple H, Rock, and Austin. They don't seem to see Vince as a father figure. They seem to see him as more of a peer. I don't know if that's because they were performing against him more. And so because like, you know, I've never, like even Triple H, who is, you know, Vince's son-in-law, well, to be confirmed if that's still the case, but you know, I've never seen him talk about having a fatherly relationship with Vince in the context of before he got with Stephanie. Like Vince is my friend. Same with Rock and Austin. They talk about Vince as a peer. So you've got this weirdness of the new generation, the kind of post-Attitude Era generation. They talk of Vince as his father figure, but the biggest stars don't.
And then that kind of reverses on itself when you get later on. Your Kevin Owens of the world do again. You know, there's like this weird like mix. It's as maybe that says something to the attitude of wrestlers now compared to that peak era. Maybe there's something to that. But yeah, I would definitely say like the Shane stuff is some of the most interesting stuff in the documentary. Like, again, talking run times as we get to the last 2 episodes in this, like I'm thinking like, okay, when are we getting to Janel Grant? When are we getting to Janel Grant? And it's like, oh, we've also got to take a sidestep into steroids and Chris Benoit. That becomes a whole thing. And we've also got to sidestep into Shane coming back and wanting to buy UFC and a lot of that, a lot of the dynamic with Vince and Shane, which is often more than the things they don't say. It's like there's like a voiceover from Vince, where they're interviewing him and he says something along the lines of, I'm very proud of what Shane has done and tried to do. It's like there's such like a backhanded compliment in that like to Vince, Shane is very clearly seen as somebody who's had bad ideas and hasn't achieved, but he's proud of them kind of nonetheless. Like that is genuinely interesting, but it's coming at a point in the documentary for me where it's coming at the expense of the other stuff I wanted them to eventually get into. That's the only issue there for me.
Yeah, and I think you feel it more if you did what I did. I know a lot of people, a lot of them went straight to episode 6. I know when they like it seemed to be you do episode 1 then episode 6, or you do episode 6 and then go 1 through 5. And I didn't. I thought I want to wait for episode 6 and go through it that way.
Same.
And the problem is you feel that so much. You just feel like, okay, there's all of this talk that really it almost needs to be re-edited rather than doing just this chronological timeline as you need to do. And The Last Dance did it, didn't it? When it went backwards and forwards in time, and you're able to tell.
Probably too much, actually, there. Like, I was so confused watching that as a non-basketball fan.
At least they physically have a timeline coming up in there as well. But you're kind of understanding the context of who Michael Jordan is in '97 and the things that made him the person that he is in that point to get to that stage. And I think what it needed to do is someone to go, right, okay, Vince has gone. This is the reasons why he has gone. What are the things that have given us the clues of really what this person is, and everything else? Because by the time we get to like say the text messages, it's basically like 10 minutes to go.
I know.
And that's
and the one
poor.
callback you do get is they do say, oh, that Vince line about I've got 3 computers in my head and one of them is constantly thinking about sex. They do bring that back for episode 6, and that is like your path into that story. But we're forgetting, and we're talking episode 6. Episode 6, which should be the Janel Grant episode, we spend half an hour on Chris Benoit. Like, how are we on Chris Benoit in episode 6? What are we doing? Like, what's going on? And that's interesting. Don't get me wrong. I want to get into that too, and what they cover there, and obviously the incendiary comments from people like Steve Austin, who should probably know better. About, the steroid scandal and Benoit and then Guerrero and all of that later. It's an interesting subject, but it's balmy. It's coming in episode 6 before we get to that stuff. I don't know what you made of that one.
Yeah, so I say the difference because I just never expected them to cover Grant that much because she wasn't participating in the documentary. And look, if this wasn't happening in America, it was happening in Britain, they just wouldn't be allowed to cover it because it's under investigation. There are pending court cases about it. It's only because America's a bit freer about what the media can cover of active criminal investigations, it's even an option. So they kind of did in terms of Grant herself. They kind of did as much as I thought they could do. I think there's stuff they miss about the broader context of WWE. So like they don't explain Linda leaving and never coming back. They don't explain Steph's initial leave of absence.
The vote.
Triple H's demotion.
What happens with the vote, and then you all change your mind? Like, I'd love to know, what happened there in that episode of Succession.
And like that is all really interesting stuff that they could talk about. There's no legal cases, no nothing, and they gloss over it, and they really do a speed run about it. And again, like that stuff's interesting. That's the type of stuff, like you say, Succession. That's the stuff that'll be interesting to the casual audience. Getting into the hook of what's it like to work in this crazy family business? What are the clashes between the family? And I think Triple H has a good line. It says, family business. No one who works in a family business says it's all hunky dory and we all love each other and we all get on. Like, it is stressful. So I think that I can almost understand why the Grant stuff isn't covered in great detail, but the other stuff is a real missed opportunity, and there's no excuse.
They could have perhaps covered it in other ways, which would have been, and whether or not they'd have been up for interviews for it, but someone like Ari Emanuel and Shapiro, who seems to be like kind of very much like the spokesperson for TKO on that higher level.
They Roman Reigns this. I think they were like, nope.
They did.
See you later. Good luck.
But then at that point, you would say we approached TKO for comment and never got back to it. You can put up that disclaimer up on there to say that you've even tried, but you don't know if that's the case. And you mentioned about Roman there as well. I mean, like, if you're talking about modern day WWE and you're going straight to Cody, it's like, well, really, the bloke he's beaten. And it mentions even at the end about Brock Lesnar, who I was thinking, is that possibly the only point where we kind of see Brock Lesnar outside of him breaking the streak? Which admittedly I was distracted because I was like, oh, there's Andy Ogden behind the bloke with the goggle eyes just looking shocked at the arena. But like, there isn't, like, he's sort of like thrown in there at the end, but he doesn't appear to be.
I'm glad they do, though. I think that's a positive, because I think too many people brush that under the carpet, including Triple H, you know, when asked about Brock Lesnar a lot long ago. Brock does what he wants, I think was the quote. And the fact that he's a central figure in these text messages and in this story and has not been seen since. To be honest, I take that as a positive. I'm glad the documentary covered it. I think you're getting more into oral history of WWE if you had any more Brock in it. I think in the early episodes, that I'd file under ruthless aggression in that. I think it's superfluous to requirements. But I was glad that was there. To be honest, I thought that was a positive for me, well, in the way they covered that element of the story.
I think I just wanted that bit more. Like, and it sounds a bit dull, but that bit more of the heavy corporate involvement that's there, and about how, and this ties in with the succession idea, the idea that you can want this family business and this idea that your children are going to take over and it's going to be family owned and everything else. But you can't if you're a publicly traded company. That's just not going to happen. There's like, you know, you can't do that. And in some ways, you need to know what is the structure of WWE today. And you get that idea of it, but again, it's kind of all thrown in like the last half an hour, and that's in and of itself expansive. But then that probably leads to the bigger issue about this, and this is probably going to be the complaint of certainly the people listening to this and hardcore wrestling fans, which is that there is those key details that are missing, whether it's small details about Brett's contract and what he had, and the fact that he wasn't turning up on Nitro the next day, and that other bullshit myth that seems to have stuck around there as well, to everything else that's going on. Like, you know, you could do those extra couple of episodes, and it's not like Netflix are massively constrained to this as well, because I think this is going to end up being a big success for them. I think ultimately they're going to look at this and it's going to be in the charts for a while. It's going to be the kind of thing that people go back to, particularly when Raw debuts on Netflix. I could see them being another uptick in people watching Mr. McMahon, because they'll look for other wrestling content on Netflix, and it'll be this or Queen of Villains, won't it? It'll be that one of the two things that come up. And I think, you know, they'll be what. So I think this isn't something that's going to be going away anytime soon.
For me, it's whether they make it there, because a lot of the, like I say, the Janel Grant stuff being at the back end of this, I was thinking watching it, like, are the vast majority of people going to actually see this part of it? Are they going to see the nice whimsical, you know, trip down memory lane that is the Attitude Era and the Monday Night War, and not actually get as far as that part of it? You know, and to be fair, like, as much as, like, I agree with what you're saying, there's elements of that story that, you know, that we know of that aren't really covered, and I absolutely think even with the limitations Will spoke of, they could have covered the Janel Grant story in more detail. There's a lot there that will be there for people to learn. You know, the fact that around the time of, you know, this documentary, you know, being a thing, and you know, everything leading into Vince resigning the first time, and you know, the fact that they had it on screen in big text, reminders of the fact that there was an ex-wrestler who had allegations against Vince, and you've got, you know, the people from Wall Street Journal kind of saying, you know, this stuff is worse than what we knew already, and, you know, drilling down in a little bit more detail than maybe I expected on some of those cases, you know, from that early time. I think the casual person watching this, if this does become massively popular and does get there, will be learning things there that are, like, you know, things that maybe need, even as wrestling fans, we need reminding of, like the scale of these allegations and the seriousness of them. You know, Ashley Mazzaro being shown on screen, and, you know, other details in there that I am glad are out there publicly.
It's pretty frank. Like it's it's quick, but it gets across the the defecation, the sex toys, the involving other men,
A lot of
the
people are going to walk away with
coercion.
that. Mentioning
I think the
wrestlers,
only
all of that.
the involvement of other men, the sharing of photos. I think this. I suppose you say the only really big detail it doesn't cover is the racial angle of some of Vince's fantasies that comes
Yeah, I was
out.
surprised. I was waiting for that to appear on screen.
So it is pretty frank, and it's franker than a lot of newspaper coverage because obviously there's a certain sense of decorum that kind of spares Vince's blushes. And the one thing it doesn't do is make clear WWE's involvement.
Yeah.
That yes, there is this court case pending. WWE's a co-defendant. It seems like they've got a mutual defense agreement in place.
Even basic stuff that like Brandon and John like are uncovering, going, well, corporate officer number 1 is very clearly Paul, whoever it is. This person's Paul Levesque, this person's Stephanie McMahon, this person I don't think we heard the name Nick Khan, did we? Like
no.
Those details, that you get that on wrestling podcasts. Why aren't we getting that on this documentary?
I think you see Nick Khan once, and it's backstage at a WrestleMania, like at WrestleMania.
Swerve did, didn't he?
Yeah, it's
Smart operator.
It's backstage with Cody when he wins it on there, and that's probably quite canny. And the idea as well, and this is one of the things they could have also mentioned, is the fact that WWE they were going to be a producer on this series. They were obviously heavily involved, and offering up like all of their content and everything else for to be used by the filmmakers, but they backtracked out of that, and you just got to think, okay, you've got to look at that like kind of response to it. That's where you would go back to like say a Meltzer, and you talk about like and in some ways I wanted to hit all again sort of some of the deeper stuff as well, the way that wrestling companies are so defensive, and they want the love of a mainstream audience, but they don't want the kind of public scrutiny that comes along with that as well. They don't they want it both ways. And Vince very much wants it both ways, and that's always
the. Any questions? Does he? I never get tired of seeing that footage of him wagging his finger, leaning in the interviewer's face, all of that stuff.
And I think you could have done a montage of that, of him on mainstream TV being asked difficult stuff. Whether that would have led into the it would have been a good aside when talking about him on Donahue and things like that, and about how uncomfortable.
Apparently, that's the name. Yeah.
That's it, and it's just like that's disgraceful. The way that he behaves there. Bob Costas, he does the same thing to him. And you've got Bob Costas as a talking head. But I don't think we see that, do they? The interview that Bob Costas does with him as well. And it's like that. Those are small missed tricks, but all of those things would have added to the idea of really who this person is, which is really should have been like, and Bill Simmons says this, like the aim, first of all, was to know who Vince McMahon is. And the second aim is to give somewhat of an overview of wrestling, which he is the pivotal figure in wrestling over like the past 50 years. And I like one of the questions I put down on here is like, what were they trying to achieve and did they succeed? And it's hard to think they succeeded in either of those areas, because we still don't really know as much about kind of what really makes this man tick. And outside of really sad to say, it's the Janel Grant case that we kind of get more of an insight into actually this is what this man is like behind closed doors. And even the potted history, it doesn't have as enough detail there that you would need in order for this to work as well. So
to me, the one bit of stuff that Vince did that made me think differently of Vince, well, there's actually just two. So there's one which is a very brief moment when he's like backstage with some wrestlers, and you can feel the awkwardness. And there's just been stuff like, again, the book I've been reading, you hear it from other people, and like Vince himself talks about it. He's actually quite an awkward guy. He's kind of built himself this world where he was in charge, almost to compensate for some natural awkwardness, some natural shyness. And you see it in these moments that he's not actually very naturally gregarious. He's not a natural, quote unquote, alpha male. He is someone trying to play a part. But then on the second episode, they begin with the Get Back or the Stand Back song, whatever it's called. And like that's something that we've seen loads of times. Jericho and Benoit made fun of it. But I think they zoom in on the coverage to really show Vince's face. And this is like a decade before Mr. McMahon. But he's played all the same faces. Like, actually, that is Vince. It's the old thing of the mask Superman wears is Clark Kent. Vince pretending to be a humble announcer in the 80s. That wasn't him. That was never him. Which is why you're allowed to make fun of Vince's announcing skills. Because Vince never liked to play that role. It was too subservient to the wrestlers. He's always wanted to be in charge.
I think you mentioned about the stand backs. The dance will stick with me probably until the day I die. But the interesting thing is when the lyrics turn about like all these men, they're gonna drop, and his voice changes from a man singing a song to him aggressively, like into the Mr. McMahon, and they're gonna drop, and it's just like, oh, okay, like you say, this is Vince who he kind of is, like showing on here. And the centerpiece of this, which at that point in time would have been weird, you've got Hogan in the background, you've got Beefcake, Randy Savage, and Jake Roberts pretending to play the saxophone, and Georgie Animal still just fucking stood there for reasons. But Vince is the star of the show, and it's almost like this is like the precursor of how he views this. It's like I am the centerpiece of this, which isn't really the case. I mean, he surrounded himself with people who were very able in particular aspects of the business. Like you mentioned, like even a Pat Patterson in terms of finishes and things like that as well. That's stuff that Vince wouldn't have had the mindset to do. Then he needed somebody else to do that as well. But I always looked at that as like, okay, this is how he views himself. It's like, wrestling is mine. This is my toy. I get to play with it. I get to create all of the rules and the regulations around it.
Before we get to other more broader thoughts, like a couple of other subjects in this that we haven't really covered. What do we make of the coverage of firstly, I'm not getting into the Montreal Screwjob, but it's a way into the Owen Hart story, which is given some time and place in this. The Benoit situation is definitely noteworthy in here, as odd as it is that it's in the last episode. But any notes on how they covered the Owen tragedy, I suppose, specifically, Will, and then we'll get into some of the other odds and ends.
Yeah, I think what they do is fine, but because they haven't explained Vince's relationship with Brett, I think there's a true for the Montreal Screwjob as well. Like, they've not explained how close those two were at one point.
No, he was going to take the belt to WCW, mate. That's it. That's all you need to know. That's it.
You see, you don't really understand just how horrible a thing that was to happen to everyone involved. And
I feel like we learned some things. I feel like you mentioned that, it just triggers in me like that quote from Vince about how we might have stopped the show if the fans had seen it, but they didn't because it was in the dark. Like, it's like, whoa, hang on, what? Like, what?
Saying the quiet part out loud there, mate. I was shocked by that.
That's a shift, isn't it, from what he's historically said? Like, historically, it's just been the show would go on even if it was, because he's asked, isn't he? Like, he's been asked before. Even if it was your son, would the show go on? He's like, yes. And watching this documentary, you learn that probably actually would be the case. But I felt like I learned a little bit there of like, whoa, that's how they see it. I don't think I've ever seen that.
Well, the argument's always been is that Vince thought there'd be a riot if they cancelled the show, and it's like, I don't think much of American wrestling fans, certainly of 1999 vintage. I think if you said a wrestler's just died, we've got to end the show, they'd be okay with it. Like, they'd be sad the wrestler's died, but they wouldn't actually riot. No one wants to see a broken down Undertaker face Steve Austin that much.
That's what I thought as well. I thought his reasoning is kind of bullshit, and it's always tied into a point that Brett doesn't. I don't think he makes it in the documentary, but he's always made it in the past, which is him viewing the wrestlers as pieces of meat. And it's like, well, there's no culpability for Vince. It's just like, well, the company who designed the harness, they were the ones who are at fault. And it's like, well, did you need to have him coming down like from the rafters anyway? Was that an essential thing for what was a very much a lower mid-card gimmick?
They don't cover what John Pollock covered in his audio documentary,
Yeah.
which is the to and fro between like what equipment they were going to use and going with somebody who made the TV better because the clasp comes off quicker, which is what leads to the lawsuit, and obviously ultimately that led to Owen Hart's death. The fact that they cut that corner, and that's on record, that's a thing that happened. That's a massive part of the story.
Because you think about Sting and how long it takes him to undo his harness and everything.
Course, yeah.
But
It's
also,
not always big
you've
TV, but it's obviously, and that's a necessity.
But also, you got the whole thing of why was Owens Blue Blazer? Because he refused to do an affair angle with Deborah.
Right. Yeah.
He didn't want to be the Blue Blazer.
Yeah.
But he felt he couldn't say no twice in a month.
Oh, they try and present it. Vince is like, we were trying to get him over. Well, you know what? We weren't trying to embarrass Brett. It's like, you've been trying to embarrass Brett. Like, you still do that now. Like, in this documentary, though, you talk about Brett, I think, it's very clear to anybody that's absolutely what you were doing with Owen during that period.
And again, this goes back to this thing of not telling the emotional story. Because obviously, then one of the things they miss out with the whole story with Brett is Brett would have become Vince's right-hand man. He would have become the booker, the new Pat Patterson. And, one of the arguments is one of the reasons why they need to get rid of Brett is they wanted to go down the Attitude Era. Like, the Attitude Era didn't begin with Montreal. It was starting to emerge in embryo. Degeneration Act had already formed. Vince had been stunned already. Stone Cold Steve Austin was a baby face. Yeah. And Brett was a handbrake. Brett wasn't comfortable with this direction. This is told brilliantly in Wrestling with Shadows. Who was one of the advocates for this new direction? Shane. Because Shane was an ECW fan. So you could have told the story of, Brett and Shane kind of battling for the direction of WWF and Shane winning, only then to be gazumped again by Steph and Triple H. But again, it won't take risks of interpretation to make those claims because it's just not what the documentary wants to do.
I think on some of the other subjects, the Benoit story, the way it's covered, I do think there's illuminating elements of that, especially the way Vince talks about it. To be honest, one of the positives, I'd say, of the documentary, as limited as what you get from Vince is, you're getting him on record talking about things he doesn't usually talk about. Like, you imagine Vince McMahon at this late stage of running WWE only really knows the current roster and probably doesn't know the names of half the wrestlers from like the mid-2000s or early 2000s, maybe with the exception of in his use in the 70s and 80s. So to get him on record saying at least a bit about Benoit, I found quite interesting, and again, he hangs himself with the talk of, sometimes people just go crazy. It's kind of like the type of daft thing your granddad would say, it's like daft things my dad will say sometimes about, saying, we didn't have autism when I was a kid, it was just kids who were slow, it's that type of thing your daft granddad will say despite everything in front of you. And I do think the documentary does a good. I've got crazy old man Vince giving his side of it, and crazy old man Steve Austin, and crazy old man Undertaker, who comes across terribly in this documentary overall. Talking about how he wasn't happy when they took the chair shots away, and they do juxtapose that very well with Chris Nowinski and his side of things. And again, there's clearly more you can get into with Chris Nowinski, his relationship to WWE, and it's not all positive, on his end as well. But I think they do a good job of letting Vince's words hang him. And then you've got somebody who at least knows what they're talking about in Chris Nowinski, talking about the brain trauma and talking about the story from that side. You got Meltzer filling in details, on the murder-suicide and all of that. I largely, thought at least strong, big elements of that were done well.
I thought there was a couple of things I thought with this part. When he was talking, it was reminding me of people who, after there's like one of the inevitable sort of school shootings that happen in the US, and people don't want to blame the guns. Here, you don't want to blame the fact that there's people who fall on their heads night after night after night, and that might have some long-term damage. And that's not a conversation that he wants to have at all. In fact, it's blame the other stuff, and it's just like, well, maybe he's just crazy, rather than sort of looking at the practices. And I mean, you mentioned there about Undertaker. I thought even during Montreal, how he was always set up for a long time, that he was waiting. This was the guy who was like that kind of like conscience of WWF at that point in time. And he saw what happened. That was wrong. That's out the window. He was like, well, it was what was best for business is what he ends up coming out with a fucking big smile on his face. Prick. And then, and now he's talking about like, that what all what like what Gotch and Hackenschmidt used to do, which was unprotected chair shots to the head, wasn't it? Like time-honored tradition in the business. It's like, was this a time-honored thing? I mean, I know that there were some wild brawls and everything else, and like with Abdullah the Butcher and Terry Funk, but they weren't the most commonplace things in the world. Like he's talking about it like they banned the fucking arm bar or something like that, or bloody hip tosses. It's just like it was kind of like it was just like a load of fucking nonsense, really. But I actually thought they probably gave the right amount of time for Benoit, even if, and this is like, we think of the things that's missed out from this. Is they don't speak about, like, say, the death of Eddie Guerrero, which then provides at least some of the context, and that's not the reason.
He appears on screen, doesn't he? Just an image. He's one of the people who died after Benoit. Which
is, again, that's a whole other thing. The idea of how many the sheer volume of wrestlers who died young.
Whether could have done a better job getting that across, couldn't he? Like a big graphic on screen or something like that. Yeah, just to show you the scale.
They're talking about, like, when talking about women's wrestling and the women's revolution, and I think it's one of the weirder clips later on where Vince is, after his WrestleMania appearance with Pat McAfee, he's surrounded by like a whole load of female members of the roster, all of whom probably would have been aware of all of these stories, and his part in how women were portrayed on wrestling TV, largely because he was in those skits and those segments himself, and it's like it's incredibly jarring. But these kind of little connective tissue things that they again, that's probably like flogging a dead horse, really talking about those little bits they missed. But I think those are things that they needed to kind of go into, because it wasn't just the conversation of CTE, it was the conversation about steroids, and part of the conversation about steroids wasn't just Benoit, it was Benoit and Eddie Guerrero. It was just like, here is this man who was carrying so much weight on his frame and his heart gave out. Like,
that's where Brett was good, in Brett having that one liner of, we were never told to take steroids, but if you look at who got pushed, and that just does that legwork for the documentary. Because without that, like, you're left with the Vince side of things, which is just, I wasn't making them take any steroids. That's obviously in the earlier bit, and it repeats here, but it's a very self-apparent thing when you look at Benoit and you look at Guerrero, and why those very, very small men add so much packed onto those very small frames.
Also with Benoit, it just shows you how Vince will not concede a point.
Yeah.
Because WWF/WWE had always been the safer promotion until Vince was desperate and was pushed into adopting the riskier style. And, long before the Benoit murder-suicide, they had been trying to scale things back. Like, there was a big thing in 2000 that they banned power drivers for a while, which is why the Undertaker started using the Last Ride rather than the Tombstone. So, like, Benoit wasn't a WWF creation. He'd learned to wrestle elsewhere. His style was clearly not WWF's style. He clearly wasn't a Vince McMahon guy. Vince could have said, this idiot was going out there doing things I would rather him not do. I was kind of told by others to let him get on with it. He's the best wrestler in the world. Look what happened. I finally took charge, made it a safer style, made changes, got rid of all this shit that Paul Heyman had introduced into the business. We can't do it because he's a man with no regrets. He's a man with no mistakes. He has to defend every corner of territory.
Absolutely. It's a very Trumpian thing. And this is like, it's that, and that all comes back to Roy Cohn, but that's a whole other podcast for another day. But this idea that you just never show weakness, and that means never apologizing. And the problem is, when people do that, is you can't relate to them. You can't relate. I mean, fundamentally, like, documentary stories about people are meant to be stories about human beings, right, wrong, flawed, innocent, all of these aspects to them. Like, they're things that they capture an audience and they make you kind of empathize, and you can put yourself in their shoes. It's very hard to do that with Vince throughout this, because he just isn't that type of figure, and he doesn't give any ground on any of this stuff. So again, when it comes to when it comes to Benoit, like there's never any culpability.
Goes back to what he said about, you know, what he actually thinks and what he's saying probably aren't the same. Any other story beats you wanted to mention, Will, through it? I had a bit on Ted Turner down, maybe. That's.
I thought the stuff with Ted Turner was good. Yeah, the footage with Ted Turner was interesting, and I think it kind of underlines that, you know, Ted was I think we've almost overcorrected, where people got so sick of Vince pretending it was just Ted Turner, ignoring Eric Bischoff. We've almost forgotten that Ted Turner was an important figure. He did make some of the key calls. Like, he should be in a Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame. I think it's ridiculous he's not, given his impact.
That season's about to start again. I'm terrified.
I think Austin and Rock were useless as talking heads.
Rock always is, isn't he? Rock's got nothing to offer.
Rock was Rock. I don't know why Austin was there. Austin just didn't seem to want to be there. By the way, I want to play poker against Austin, because whenever he's saying bollocks, he starts scratching his ear like this. And so, like, you know, if he does that, you just go all in on him.
I'm not a CTE guy. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I barely had any concussions in my career. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Fuck off, Steve. Like, we've seen those chair shots, mate.
It's like, I think I only had one concussion, and they showed Owen Hart Power Driver that broke his neck. It's like, oh yeah, just a one concussion, Steve. I think this is, again, it goes back to that line from Shane about, you know, Vince has the rap he wants. Vince wants to be the guy in control.
Yeah.
And so one of the things they are very skittish about is explaining how dependent he is on TV. And that if he loses TV, he doesn't have a business. And so it's like, why doesn't he accept the plea deal? And Vince is like, well, it's because I want to show the federal government what's what. And I think it's Dave makes the point that, you know, Dave Meltzer and Bonnie Hammer from USA, they make the point that, no, if he'd copped the lesser plea, they would have kicked him off the station, and that would have been the end of WWF. And they don't talk about them leaving USA, which was like the big moment along with going public, when they kind of go to another level as a company. You know, he becomes a billionaire. They don't talk about the fiasco of the 2005 rights when TNN cancel. Spike cancel Raw. And that's when Vince starts to want to create the network. Because actually, I think if you'd asked Vince what his legacy was, you know, back in 2022, it's that I allowed WWF to control its own, WWE to control its own destiny, unlike other sports, other pro wrestling promotions who got controlled by their TV station, you know, WCW being controlled by Turner, for example.
Yeah.
And it was always a mirage. You know, the TV companies were always in control. Vince was never in control. You know, Dick Edsel, Bonnie Hammer, whoever was in charge of Viacom in the early noughties, these were the people who ruled pro wrestling. It was never Vince. And now as we move to the new era in 2025, it's going to be Netflix. You know, they're going to run pro wrestling. They're going to run WWE. You know, same with AEW. You know, we can all talk about Tony Khan and what he's achieved. He lives or dies by what Zasloff decides.
Yeah.
And I think that's, they don't want to pull on that thread. They want to indulge Vince with his fantasies that he was in charge of wrestling, and he never was, and he never will be.
How about you, JP? Any other threads of story in there that we haven't covered?
I think there's things around an area I would have liked them to go down, and the unionization is kind of hinting at that. And I think that's very interesting, but it disappears quite quickly. And it would have been nice to kind of even hear from Jesse Ventura on this, who I imagine would have been like someone good to be able to speak about.
Especially if you asked them in 2024.
Oh, exactly. You know? Well, why did he feel unionization is necessary? Which then that takes us to the whole realm of, and I put this under things that we're missing, the idea of the independent contractor, the kind of how the structure of wrestling finance works, which probably, as much as I would love it, is maybe not exciting documentary fodder. But sometimes it's hard to think, well, they've sold out all these arenas around the world and these stadiums, yet they're nearly going under. Well, why is that the case? Like, how is business decreased to that kind of point? Like, and then them explaining perhaps what is the situation, like you said, Will, there a minute ago, there about the importance of TV and about the control of TV and how that plays so much of a bigger part in that. That would have been an area that I would have loved to have seen them expand on it more. And it, again, as I said earlier on, the idea that Hogan admitting to something that he never has publicly admitted before, which was it was him who went to Vince and said, as to quote him, Jesse's stirring up some shit, which by stirring up some shit, it's trying to get wrestlers paid the amount that they should be paid as well, which then made me always think as well about, like, kind of, I know it's going to sound a really daft thing. It would have been interesting to see Vince's house. It would have been interesting to, you know, those little kind of aspects of, like, well, what was the lifestyle that he kind of lives and things like that. That would have been more into kind of getting into the kind of human element as well. It's quite skittish around the treatment of women in wrestling. Now, this was the stuff that when I was watching it with Vicky seemed genuinely appalled by it, because you just realize how horrific it is at that point in time. And it's not an excuse just to go, you know, oh, well, it was different times and that's how things were. It's just like, no, this is a common theme throughout, whether you go to Rita Chatterton, you go to Wendy Richter, and then you go into that kind of like that Divas era and how women were treated. And Trish
which
Stratus
didn't work there at the time they interviewed her, you know. I imagine she had
Yeah.
different things to say. I wish Sable wasn't married to Brock and they could ask her. I wish, you know, Stacey Keebler was willing to come forward and talk about some of the footage they showed of her.
You go
Where
on,
was,
like,
like,
say the
Charlotte
Okay,
Flair talking about how different it is for to be a female performer in WWE in the 2020s, how the landscape is entirely different, how there is parity or a degree of perceived parity when it comes to screen time, when it comes to importance, and even and trust me, it isn't. I know it's not 50-50 in terms of like equality when it comes to how the idea of stars, but it's like nowhere near what it used to be. Even the women's revolution, there's like a very small cursory mention. It's like you never ran another pay-per-view of it again. Like that was something I felt that they kind of like skitted over. I've even written
You
down
also got to that really late.
Oh yeah,
10
really
years after
late.
a women's revolution would have at least been apt.
But there was a bit where the Kiss My Ass Club is shown. I remember turning around and seeing Vicky's face, and she's just like, "What the fuck is this?" There's no context and anything else, and go, "This was a thing that he was doing on TV," and you kind of then go, "Why would you do that? Like, why would that be something that you think that actually this is what the audience wants to see?" And there have been people who cheered it in the arenas at the time, but it wasn't like, it was just like, it was very much like that feels like the insight into Vince.
We're just giving it. We're not the bad guys. It's the audience who are the bad guys because they want this stuff. They want to chant slut at Stephanie, even though we've manipulated the audio in the documentary to make it sound like they did that when she was a babyface. They didn't. They did it when she was a heel. Really hated that moment of that episode. But yeah, it's the audience's fault according to Triple H. You know, so that's what we should learn.
But it's also because I think one of the things the documentary doesn't make clear is like you take the Trish Stratus barking like a dog angle, which I think highlighting that is a good thing for the documentary because it was, you know, a disgraceful angle. It was disgraceful at the time. Sky wouldn't show it. That got edited off our broadcast of Raw, you know, back on the Friday after, because no, they thought it would break British broadcasting regulations. I think they did a really good job. Because one of the things that you always used to be said about Vince McMahon, Mr. McMahon, like this is something I think Foley said in Foley is good. Like, look, whatever Vince asks you to do, he'll do it himself. Look at all the stuff that he did. And like that's to some extent true in like 97, 98, 99. But actually by 2000, he's not doing anything particularly unpleasant or risky. most of the time. He is just bullying people and groping women and kind of indulging his fantasies. And by that point, he's not in a money-drawing feud. No, he could have turned himself babyface, be the father of the promotion. You know, that'd been a good thing for him to do with the WCW purchase coming down the pipeline. But like Vince wanted to get his kicks, wanted to get his rocks off basically, and wanted to use his workers to do that. And I think it does a good job of just showing just how clearly Vince was taking advantage of his ability to script women to do sexualized angles with him as the notice went over. Like, it could have been a bit more explicit. It would ideally have had a woman performer say, "This was gross. Why being made to kiss this old man?" But within the limitations of the format, they did kind of make that point.
Absolutely.
And maybe you're talking about it there, that this is the bigger overall problem, is that even with the format, like trying to cover the sheer volume of content, stuff that we've gone into on here, and trust me, there's other stuff they've missed that I'd love to hear him talk about, even the invasion. Even like, I mean, they were never going to.
I'm glad they didn't. I'm glad they didn't waste an episode on it. But I get what you mean. It wasn't there, was it? When other maybe lesser historical notes like the Undertaker's streak were covered.
Yeah, exactly. But there's so much content that you have to kind of cover for this. The 6 parts is never going to do it justice. There's a reason why WWE, like even when they did their documentary series on the Monday Night War, there was like 10 episodes of that. That's quite deep into the weeds. Lots of stuff happens. It's not just the simple reason of what one thing, even who killed WCW. That's like, it needed more than 4 episodes if you're ever going to do that like real kind of justice. And that's it. I think in this documentary, it's like you're trying to serve both those masters. You think, okay, we want to do a documentary on Vince McMahon, but we also want to do it about a history of wrestling, and that you can't really do both because you're going to miss stuff out. And it's the stuff that you miss out that actually in culmination, all of those bits you miss out actually means you're missing out quite a bit, even if that's not your intention. And I'm more like, when I think back on it, I think that like the filmmakers themselves, this is like you're on a hiding to nothing here, because you're dealing with some of the craftiest bastards out there who are basically taught to no sell and deny and lie and bluff, and that's just how the industry is. And I don't think these level of filmmakers, he wouldn't have had that when he was doing Tiger King. You would have had people who would have been more than happy to talk about all things to the camera and be able to kind of go, yep, I very much act like an open book. And you got the opposite here. And that's why I think when you mentioned about The Rock and Austin being useless talking heads, therein lies your big problem.
I could see it like a truncated, and Netflix have done this before with, you mentioned it, Tiger King making a murderer, like a truncated season 2, which is the PS he went to prison for the rest of his life. Hopefully series that you get, and maybe you get a little bit of like, you know, extra colour on some of those elements in there. Maybe, I don't know. But yeah, as we kind of get to wrapping up and overall thoughts, like anything else that you wanted to cover, Will? Any particular talking heads that were notable? Any best worst episodes, that type of thing?
Yeah. I mean, I really enjoyed episode 1 and the first half of episode 2 when it was still in the 80s.
Me too.
Because you're just not used to WWE covering that era with a very business-first approach. Like, they do so much of this kind of the business of the business for the Monday Night Wars. They tend to just focus on the storylines for the 80s. So, like, that was fun. Like, it was, you know, it was empty calories content, and it was missing a lot, but it was interesting. I think the best episode in terms of this is something that you could have made the whole documentary was episode 5, because Shane's just the most captivating character, and and he was getting stuff out of Vince when they were going to Shane and they were going to Vince and saying, Shane said this. Vince would become a bit more alive. Vince would come back. Vince would bite on some things.
Yeah, I'd like I said, like first 2 episodes was kind of like, oh, this isn't so bad. 3rd and 4th episode just killed any idea of binging for me. Like I got to the end of episode 4 and was like, I just don't want to watch the next episode now. I don't want to hear the same old history rehashed. And then I actually sat down today and watched episode 5, and it got me back into the series because it was that element we keep pushing. You know, you mentioned about Shane, like that could have been the whole episode. Triple H and Vince's relationship again, you probably can't tell that story now, but in 5 and 10 years, you know, we always say it on the podcast, JP, you know, people younger than us forget exactly how Triple H ended up in the position he did, and how even before that he was already seen as a political maneuver. It wasn't just that Shane didn't want a wrestler going out with his sister, it was that he probably very likely saw there's a political maneuver trying to get into the family and trying to, you know, get that spot, which long term he got. Maybe there's a Triple H documentary that comes at some point down the line where you kind of cover that. But I do agree, episode 5 was one of the stronger ones, and I was ready to almost throw the towel in on the idea of giving this a favourable review at all.
Episode 4 was
the elements of it, like too.
Episode 4 was awful. Like
Really
I was getting worried they weren't going to talk about Steve Austin. It's going to be another Generation X, calls the Attitude Era, and it's just like
they did. You on about it was Sean? It was all Sean. It was when Sean stuffed the sock down his pants. What are you on about? That was the launch. They tried.
Yeah, there is. I would be in agreement in terms of the must-watch episodes, and you know, strange because we've gone in for a lot of criticisms of it overall as a series and the flaws of the series. It's still something that, as a wrestling fan, you should watch, if only because you're watching one of the largest entertainment companies in the world in Netflix get one of their preeminent documentary filmmakers to make a quite big budget, well produced series on professional wrestling, which has access to a lot of the biggest characters. And then you can kind of make your own mind up. But I would say 1 and 2, because it gives you that kind of historical element of, well, why is WWF/WWE in the position that they're in today? You need that. You need to know what it was they went through in the 80s and the kind of the variety of risks.
Good footage there too as well. You wouldn't think they had. Was Vince accommodated all that stuff behind the scenes with his dad?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think all of that, and even then, I you know, I'll say another thing on this, like a thing that you'd like to see is really what was the dynamics between Vince's dad and his mum? Like, how did he come back into contact? He just sort of like, his dad appears one day and he's just hanging around with his dad.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay. And unfortunately, on the family side of it, you hit that problem for him. That formative years, you haven't got that other figure who was there, which the only other person you think that would be is his brother, who's not around. But then you wonder whether or not, did he tell his children about this? Did he tell his wife about this? Would they have been willing to talk? Because they would have been interesting figures just because they were slightly removed from it. Episode 5, like I said, the Shane stuff, the family element, you're kind of getting back into stuff that feels new and feels fresh for us. 3 and 4 was just like, this is shit I've already known. I've seen this ad infinitum across many documentaries across all these years and reading books and everything else. It's like the most obvious low-hanging fruit. And I suppose you've got to watch episode 6, even with the flaws in it, as well as how much time you give for Janel Grant. You still need that, even if there are bits of it where you're just thinking, yeah, but it doesn't have this, this, and this in it as well. So maybe there will be an amendment, which will only be really depends on how well it does in terms of the viewing figures, which Netflix are always so cagey about releasing. But I think when we get those, we'll get a better idea of what they see, also how much value they see in professional wrestling at that point in time. In this point in time, they go, oh, hang on a minute, there's a massive interest in this. This is a route we should go down. And it made me think they'd probably end up hiring Ryan Murphy, who did the Jeffrey Dahmer and the Menendez brothers series that have recently come onto Netflix, to probably end up doing something about Chris Benoit. That wouldn't surprise me. That's where my mind went. They probably went, oh, there's stuff to be kind of like really gotten into on this.
Yeah,
and of course,
go on.
And of course, the great thing for Netflix is where this ends is we have the new WWE led by Triple H, who would never hurt a fly. So like you can cover.
It makes sure the Fly lost his job, though. Will that much would guarantee to happen.
But you can cover the bad history, the bad old days of WWE, because that was all done by the evil man who's gone now.
Yeah.
Bam,
So you can continue to broadcast Raw and SmackDown on Netflix, whilst also exploiting all the misery the company's caused in previous decades.
Yeah.
I actually don't think they went as far as they could have with the Bad Man Gone stuff. With that, like I say, they could have leaned on how bad the creative was and how happy the fans are now with it all. They almost missed that open goal, as dodgy as it would have been to go there. But yeah, I think overwhelmingly thoughts on it. I agree on episode 6. I'm glad it exists. I'm glad we've seen the Janel Grant side come out with I think they issued a list of examples of Vince McMahon and WWE's toxic culture, kind of thanking the documentary for existing. And it's kind of and however, you're aware of this, and it's a big list of all the allegations against Vince over the years, from Sable to Rita Chatterton. Sadie's Monet's names is even mentioned in there. Ronda Rousey and some of the things she said recently. It's given some legs to that side, which I think is a positive, and I think it will, if they make it there, for more casual people, expose them to this story that it's out there, and it's very much a live case that it's been parked for the federal investigation, which is again one of the, you said Will, that recurring theme of the text at the end of the episode. That's the end of episode 6 that you get. So if anything, I am overall, while we've had a lot negative to say, I'd say a lot critical, I'm glad it exists. I got some enjoyment out of it in pieces. I didn't necessarily learn anything, but I did find some bits of history illuminating and interesting, and I was reminded a little bit of things I already knew but I wasn't thinking about when it comes to maybe even Vince himself and the various allegations against him that led to his first exit. But that's my overall take on it. Glad it exists. Wish there was more to it. Wish there were more episodes, and almost wish there's a follow-up coming.
That's the thing. I think I came away thinking still that there is a bigger documentary about really the influence that pro wrestling has in so many aspects of modern culture nowadays, particularly politics, and to a certain degree, some aspects of entertainment. I think there's a much bigger one that looks at it from very much a bird's eye view at this kind of weird niche industry, but it creates its own set of rules that the people within that industry are governed by. But also it's the fact that you can't have normal relationships. The people behave in a way that's completely unregulated. So there's been lots and lots of horrific stuff happening. I think there's things like that it could do, which fingers crossed that there is some degree of follow-up to.
You know who'd be perfect to do that? Adam Curtis.
Oh yeah, that would be. It would be too weird and esoteric for him to do that. He'd have pictures of people in the 1950s doing some sort of slow dancing. A sexy boy plays in the background and stuff like that with his voice over there.
I think this is a very minor point, but what do we make of it dropping on a Wednesday? Is that them tilting their hand to when they may want Raw to drop?
Oh, I didn't think you were going there. I thought you were going with you trying to distract from the Nigel Bryan match on Wednesday night.
That's another possibility.
It worked on my Twitter timeline, to be fair, but I'm sure it wasn't the motivation. I'd say probably not. It's probably a different arm, isn't it, of Netflix, this type of show versus...
yeah.
I'd love Raw to move nights, but yeah. I just want the whole wrestling, I just want to shuffle. I want to see Dynamite on a Saturday or a Monday maybe. I want to see SmackDown on a Tuesday. I want to see some change. I don't think it's coming though. I think it'll be Monday.
I think it'll be Monday. I think the reason they just drop it on a Wednesday is, and it seems to be a pattern with them, is they'll release fiction on a Friday. They'll release that big film on a Friday for people to watch.
I mean, half of this was fiction, to be fair. Just to make the obvious joke.
Yeah, that's true. I think Wednesdays is the day when you can drop a drama like this, because it's not restricted by time outside of the point when obviously the federal investigation is completed and we hear what the results are as a result of that. And I think it's that idea that people would want that to be that slow burn of watching 1 or 2 episodes to go into the weekend, maybe then finishing it off. And then, I wouldn't think of it any more than that. Yeah, there is. And they do this a lot now. Quite often you'll go on there and they're just dropping new stuff randomly. And you're like, oh, that's on there now. And they just decide that I think Wednesday is just an arbitrary day for when they were going to release it.
The other thing I have is, whenever you guys next to observe this, what you could do I was looking at the credits, and obviously they dub all the talking heads. So for an observe this in the future, you could rank all the different dubs of Dave Meltzer. Now, do we like German Dave or Romanian Dave or Japanese Dave? Which is the best Dave?
Well, we didn't get many of them in there, did we? Not enough.
I was shame. I want to see dubbing Vince and how many times you'd hear, quite frankly, and things of that nature being repeated on a loop. I
Stuff for the
hate
cutting room floor is what I want to see. I want to see a director's cut. I want to see like just the interview tapes. Just release them as is. Let's watch them. Totally.
I think they will do, because they did speak on the Ringer podcast about how the Evil Knievel story was great and they loved going into it, and they had to drop it just because of they had their allocated amount of time, and therefore they couldn't spend their time covering that.
Podcast. Just
Yeah.
frog voice Vince McMahon fucking lands himself in the ship for 3 hours.
The Evil Knievel story is great.
Well, there we go. Anything else, Viv? Anything else there, Will, on the story or anything before we let you go? Anything else?
Well, I think like I got about 2/3 of the way through this, so sex lies and headlocks. If like this has whetted your appetite for like a potted history of the first half of Vince McMahon's run of WWF, well worth digging out if you can find a copy. It's pretty old now. I've had this for ages. But like it gets across things. It's gone. I would say it's got anti-WWF lean. Like it makes a lot of fun of Hogan in terms of Hogan being a bad wrestler. But it's an interesting story, and it does get across the bare bones of the story quite well. So like I'd probably give a recommendation to that. In terms of plugs, you can catch me on City AM every other week. Most recent article was defending Keir Starmer because everyone's being mean to him. At some point, I'll do some stuff for Pro Wrestling Torch and my podcast, It Could Be Said.
And you can report, eh? What happened to that?
Well, we know we need a deeper dive now. So like you guys, I decided not to shackle myself to
I miss the music. That's the main.
Too much scandal and like that clean cut WWE.
True.
But you can also catch me on Blue Sky at Will Cooling at Blue Sky. So
I was gonna actually, before we do let you go, we were gonna go into some news and reviews and stuff. Do you actually have any thoughts? I'm guessing you do on the first story we're gonna go into, the Rey Fenix contract story, and being his contract being extended by AEW as we get into some of the other news and headlines to somewhere close to a year. We're told apparently Penta's deal was also extended, but for much less time, and is still expected to land in WWE. This coming from Meltzer himself and the Observer over this weekend. Couldn't let you not have an opportunity to go on that.
Yeah, like as a point of principle, I just don't think contracts should be extended due to injury. If you think someone's faking an injury, get them to report to an arena, get them to take a health exam, and if you think they're fit to work and they're refusing, you can then take penalties there and then. But if you've accepted they're injured and they're injured working for you, tough, like that's on you. That's kind of like the breaks when it comes to promoting a contact sport. So I don't agree with it. I don't agree with this when they did it to Kenny Omega. I don't agree with it now. Now, that said, if this means Pentagon gets to WWE before Phoenix and they may use him as a singles, that would actually be quite good for them, because I think that act is less than the sum of its parts when it comes to TV wrestling. They would be better off as two singles. But yeah, like I've always wanted to go back and watch some of the Lucha Brothers from their indie run to work out whether they were as good as we thought and just been misused by AEW, or whether we were wrong and we were overrating them and it was like big fish, small pond syndrome. Because the AEW run has been a real bust when you think about how big a set of stars those guys were, not just live and independents, but what Pentagon was doing on TNA. Like, he was the guy chosen to go up against Kenny Omega at the initial All In because he was that level of star.
Yeah, you forget that. Like, I think that's more like, it's the sum of the parts argument that I've kind of been, swinging for these whole years they've been there. Because as a team, I think they they had a good run as a tag team in AEW. They ran out of things they can do with them outside the trio stuff. They had some all-time great AEW matches, it has to be said, especially the one with the Bucks was the one that always comes to mind in the cage. Like, I think as a team they ran their course. Where I think the nuances and the argument is, as singles did AEW get them out of them? Like, there's plenty of audio of us in 2022 going, it's still good, or maybe 2021, like going like, Phoenix is going to get that title run, Phoenix is going to get that top guy as a singles run, Pentagon has untapped potential as a marketable star in his own right. They're the things I think we didn't get. They're the things that, and obviously them being tied to Alex Abrahantes, and again, just the packaging of them being very lacking.
You mentioned packaging. Packaging is the operative word. What the fuck would he do with Pac all this time?
I know. I found out this week, I think somebody said that in the Discord, he was a 32-year-old man when he signed for AEW, which is mind-blowing because he'd been around so long. You'd think he was like 40 when he came in. That man's still got a lot of prime left, that we've not necessarily made the most of.
Like, he's been with Claudio for what, a month? And they have more chemistry and have been more entertaining than Death Triangle was for 4 years.
Yeah.
Like, how they flogged that faction for that long is beyond me.
And you might be right about, Penta, I'd less look at his indie run and I'd more look at, like, bloody hell.
Sorry. That was, as soon as I came back on camera and put the mute on there, Benji just made a dive for Vicky's food. I'll
turn that audio down and post.
Apologies.
I was going to say, Penta, like, it was just packaging in Lucha Underground that I think people were looking at with rose-tinted spectacles. I think their indie run was the same as what we got in AEW. Some fun matches with lots of poses, lots of catchphrases, and lots of high spots. I don't know if necessarily that's where it is either as well. But to go to you, JP, like, it's such an emotive subject, isn't it? And there's been arguing back and forth on our Discord all weekend about it with the contract matter. Like, my broad take on it, even getting out of whether I think AEW got the most out of both of them. Like, I think for me, once you've signed that contract, and maybe the conversation starts and ends there. And that's a deeper problem, talking about Jesse Ventura, talking about unionization, talking about the power of wrestlers. The fact that wrestlers are signing contracts that say, if you get injured, we can tack that time onto the end of your contract is actually where the core of this issue lies. And if you're not resolving that, and we're in a world where that is in the word of the contract, then by the law of the contract and just technically, there's not necessarily anything wrong with what Tony Khan has done. Is it the moral? I don't know if moral is the right word. Is it the moral thing to do? Is it the right thing to do? That's where the conversation comes in. And it, as much as I hear that side of it, and you'll hear people say things like, "This is Tony Khan putting his foot down for once. Do you not want that?" I hear that argument. This is what's written into the contract. Should the company not get their time out of Penta and Phoenix? If they're injured, and I hear that too. But something just doesn't sit right in this very physical wrestling industry, as Will kind of mentioned before, in that if a wrestler, and in Phoenix's case, it sounds like it's 3 different periods where he's been injured, have all been lumped together to be added on his time at the end of this contract. Like, he got hurt in those 3 instances working for that company. Like, that's where, like, again, maybe it's the contracts needing to be rewritten, but that's where it doesn't just sit right with me, that you can then go, well, you got injured, working for me, well, I can add more time to it. And that's where it is different than all our real lives, because you'll hear people bring up, their own workplaces and what would happen there, and name me a workplace where if you were off sick for 3 months and then you tried to leave, they went, well, actually, you're always 3 more months, you've got to fit that in. It's obviously not that, because we're talking independent contractors rather than employees. But again, another reason why it doesn't sit right. And yeah, it's more of that. It's more of maybe it's an emotional argument. Maybe it's more of a guttural, that just feels icky argument when it comes to, AEW doing what WWE have done a lot in the past, what TNA have done in the past too. Josh Alexander's another big example of it, or at least a similar-ish case to that. But it just doesn't sit right as the thing, really, even if you can make all the arguments in the world, it's technically correct.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you on this one. It's not the idea of people having a contract and they're there for a set amount of time. It's the idea of adding on time that they've had getting injured in what was a very physical profession and getting injured on your watch. And the idea that's something to be held against them as a reason to not let them leave. that I don't like, because, but then it also, for me, gets into the idea of people want to leave. I look at other sports. I think about this. I mean, at Arsenal, there were a variety of players that they wanted to get rid of, and they got rid of them. Turned out to be a great move. I'm talking about this in 2024, but it turned out to be a good move, because it was a lot of people who didn't want to be there, and it was like, well, you want them rid because you've got to think about the morale. You've got to think of the atmosphere, and it's just like, well, what do you do with these people? They're going to be there to lose. So how are they going to be when they go into work and when they're backstage? And it also sends a message to the other people of like, it could be you next. And that's not the kind of vibe you want, particularly as Tony Khan, who always wants to be considered to be a good boss. Like, that's not really the vibe and the image that you want around the place. So I'd be more inclined to say, okay, if you let them go now, what are you really missing out on? Obviously, you don't have to pay them, but they're not what they were. They're not these massive. This isn't Kenny Omega or John Moxley or Bryan Danielson or Swerve Strickland. This isn't like these aren't like top line guys. Was there the potential to do something with them, as we've spoken about many times in the past? Absolutely. Is it ever going to happen there? No, it's never happening in AEW. So I almost think you're just better off going, okay, these guys could end up coming back in a few years' time. Let them go. Like, what are you really missing out on? And it's a way of also, like, I want to say, culling the roster somewhat, which has always been the big issue with AEW. But it's two guys you're not using. And for Penta to go in as a singles, I'm kind of almost with Will on this. I'm just like, it feels like that's a different presentation of Penta immediately. So do something with him on that. And if you're not going to do that on AEW, then, well, there's no fucking point. Like, there really isn't any point in keeping them around unless you're keeping them around in order to lose to people. It makes sense. It does seem petty.
Do you reckon it's something to do with Regal, Will? Do you reckon it's to do with that fucking weird I'm not a snake because I'm wearing a t-shirt that says I'm not a snake tweet we got from Regal? Maybe that's changed, because it was only a couple of weeks ago it was being reported they weren't going to do this and Tony Khan was going to take the high road. Something's happened there to make him that. And all these things are case by case, because again, I get it. You don't want to give someone to your opponent. It's like Miro and Malachi Black and that. At this point, I'd just let Miro go. I might not have said that 2 years ago. I might have said, well, you got a long contract on him. Like, you can't like set a bad example. You should probably not let people like shout the way out of your company. Same with Malachi Black. Probably just let him go now. How long's left in his deal, really? Is it worth it? Probably not. I'm guessing time was added to Miro's deal, because his a weird one. It's like it'll be 6 years by the time he's allowed to go, apparently, or 6.5 years, I think, which is no way what his contract was. Some of these fights aren't worth it.
I like Joe Janela's line, which was what they need to do is get into an altercation backstage with Jungle Jack Perry, and then they'll be allowed to go. Again, it goes back to that thing of like, look, you don't want people to take the piss. So if you don't think they're injured, call them in, check. Like that's the way you stop people faking injuries. Yeah. For people like Malachi, people like Miro, you just tell them, I will extend your contract if you refuse to work, unless you buy yourself out of your contract. Now, here's how much your contract's worth. If you want to go to WWE, you buy me out, and hope WWE will make you whole. That to me is the fair deal, because obviously contracts have to mean something. Otherwise, it's a one-sided bet by the performer. But yeah, like I just feel like Phoenix, Pentagon, as far as I can tell, they've done everything the promotion's asked for them. They've been good soldiers. They've put up with bad presentation. I would let them go. I think you're just creating bitterness that there is a need to cause for no benefit.
Or very minimal benefit, really. It's there, but there we are. That's the latest on the story. We'll see what happens. But I do kind of broadly do agree as well. Yeah, maybe some separation wouldn't be the worst. Maybe Penta debuts now. Maybe Phoenix gets out of his deal sooner rather than later, just not today. I don't know. Maybe Tony Khan will want that. And again, by saying that this is not the ideal segment, is not. We've just spent almost 2 hours on the crimes of Vince McMahon and WWE. We are not. We acknowledge those crimes are 20 times worse before anybody comes for us. We are not saying they are equal just because WWE also did this. When WWE did this, we gave them grief on this podcast. When they release people when they shouldn't, we gave them grief on this podcast. So.
People have been complaining about this since like Death of WCW.
It's not new.
You know, like this is not a new problem in pro wrestling. And like Brian Alvarez in Death of WCW goes into this. You talk to actual sports stars, actual athletes. They cannot believe wrestlers have this in their contracts.
Yeah.
Like, can you imagine going to a footballer? Well, you were injured for 9 months because you took a bad tackle. So
Dominic Calvert-Lewin would never leave Everton. He'd be
I was going to say, he's never leaving, is he, that bloke? Callum Wilson better be making plans to live in Newcastle for the rest of his life. He's not going anywhere.
Dan Anderton would be a one-team man, wouldn't he, you know?
God, yeah.
Final question from Simon here. Will, if Lucha Brothers are still under contract, has this been contract tampering took place if they were supposed to be the rebound? There's some elements of that in there, but is it even a thing? That's another thing where wrestling's unique, isn't it? Like, yeah, it's happening on both sides, isn't it? You know, if you believe Swerve.
There's always go-betweens and everything else, isn't it? That's it. I mean, I can't think of who the go-between is in this case. Conan.
Again, whose fault this might be if we're talking William Regal, you know? It's probably that.
Yes, it probably is Conan, actually.
Yeah.
Because he'd been bad-mouthing Tony on his podcast, hadn't he?
That's it, yeah. Don't listen to that podcast. It won't do you any good. Or his old podcast where he used to say a lot of shite too. But yeah, on that note, Will, we'll let you run. Thank you. Great getting your takes on the Vince documentary. Always a fantastic guest, Will. And I didn't kick you off, mate. I'll let you run this entire time. So.
Oh, thank you for not kicking me off, Ben. That's very nice of you.
You're welcome.
By the way, did you see the cricket score earlier today?
There he goes. He queued me up there. Nice one, Will. Always good having you on, Will. But yeah, brilliant. That's another cracking chat with Will on the Vince story. But we should talk as well some of the other things going on in wrestling. JP this week, obviously the Rey Fenix contract story is one of the big ones. That is a bit on our Patreon, by the way. Me and Will don't just hate each other just for the video viewers there. It's a pretend war, but it's we'll get a bit of rum at him during the Christmas show, and then we'll kick him off again, and all things will be right in the world. But no, Will was fantastic there and great on the Rey Fenix story as well, which we've covered. Speaking of the other news, JP, speaking of contract stuff, Saraya's re-signed. Any hot takes on that? What we get into some of the AEW happenings of the weekend?
This one I don't get. At least Phoenix and Pentagon have a degree of talent. And this was only confirmed to me when watching Collision today to squeeze it in before this show, as we'll get into in a bit. That was a couple of hours I'm never getting back. I just thought, like, what possible value does she have? And she'd cost loads. Yeah. I don't see what, really what the benefit is. There isn't benefit from, like, a promotional perspective. They're not running it doesn't seem like they're running the UK anytime particularly soon. I mean, they'll be here next year for Forbidden Door. We're going to do her versus Mayu Iwatani. Like, is that really something you got worth hanging around for? Like, what is she there for? At this stage, she is just the most bog standard mid card heel act. That I think mid card's being polite. It's just this is opening act shit basically.
And to be fair, I was open on that shit. I thought she was all right on Collision this week. I thought that match was fine, but it would have been a great write-off. It would have been a great, and now she's gone forever. You will never see the bad lady again. Maybe it's something to do with a fucking gobshite boyfriend deleting his Twitter. Maybe now they can get away with keeping her. But this feels like one where, you talk about in the Phoenix story, a lot of the positives people were pushing was like, well, he's been a soldier for Tony, so Tony sees that and he's going to keep him. Saraya is someone who clearly Tony has become close to and feels like he owes, but yeah, for what value at the end of it? Like, there's a lot of other people who can do that job that she does in the card.
And the value for her is in WWE. That's the value for her. If she turned up on WWE TV tomorrow, would she get a massive response? Probably. As much as I wouldn't be responding
Keep
to it.
Keep it away from the competition. Maybe that's half the thought.
To that, yeah. But how much does that
wrestle them?
Yeah, that's it. And how much would they even gain if they did let her wrestle? I don't. I think the thing is, it's one of these signings that has proven rather and it falls into the line under Miro, Malachi Black, Keith Lee, of people who you looked at and thought, well, this could work under these set of circumstances and you might get some value out of it, and that's just never really materialized. So you're better off just cutting loose. And she's not cheap. in order to get her to come out of retirement and stuff. She isn't cheap. And is that money better spent elsewhere? Unless she spends a year doing jobs and making sure she puts Willow Nightingale over, which is not going to happen.
It's whether as well on top of that, like, you know, what does it cost to bring all the Knight family to Wembley once a year? You know, you got to think about those costs as well, and then what they nick while they're there, allegedly. Anyway, Chris Elliott had here. Simon asked the same question I did. Would we even wrestle? I think the answer is no. I think, you know, and that's one of the uniqueness things about AEW. But maybe under this new regime, maybe she would find her way in. But yeah, I thought that was an interesting news note. Another one, Swerve Strickland has been in the news, saying that AEW is about to get on Fox. I never thought I'd say these words, JP, but on Queen's Flip's YouTube channel, if you don't know who Queen's Flip is, just imagine Matty, but like on the Joe Budden podcast. He basically delivered the same thing to the Joe Budden podcast, who's a rapper, by the way, just to get in there, JP, that Matty provided to us. That same degree of chaos. Fucking brilliant. I love Queen's Flip, one of the funniest men in podcasting, but on that podcast he very much does what Matty does, and he disrupts, and he is actually a wrestling fan. I often see him on that podcast or on Twitter talking about WWE. He seems like a very casual wrestling fan, but he definitely follows at least WWE closely. But he had Swerve on like a live stream, it was, where Swerve, I think the two quotables from Swerve on there were one, Tony Khan lets me do whatever the fuck I want, which is like, no cameras on you right now, Swerve. Okay, mate. Threw in there that he owned the Jacksonville Jaguars, which is also adds a bit of credibility. But did outright say we're about to get on Fox because SmackDown's leaving Fox, and then we're taking Fox, TNT, TBS, and Fox. We got all three of them things. Swerve said. I'm not sure exactly when this was recorded, but it was in the last couple of weeks. But yeah, I presume Swerve knows more than most of us do, giving the game away there when. You know, most of us don't really expect AEW to really land on proper Fox, at least.
Yeah, that's it. I think that's the big thing here. Is he's talking about proper Fox. He's not talking about Fox Sports 1. He's not talking about True TV. Oh no, True TV is Warner Brothers Discovery. I get confused. But one of the other kind of like smaller channels in the Fox network. He's talking about Fox proper, and I think he means like within the Fox television sort of nations on there as well, but we've not really had any update on that, have we? In the last couple of weeks, we kind of know it's been shipped around. That it's. I think
we'll get it with the anniversary show on Wednesday.
I think so.
Likely thing. But yeah, moving on from there, Grand Slam. Obviously, we talk Grand Slam Dynamite on the weekend show. If anybody wants our elongated thoughts on that, if you want my shorter thoughts, one of the greatest Dynamites, at least of the year, I would say. Fantastic tag team title match, which was fantastic, and a brilliant match, at least, or bit of business in Nigel and Brian. A lot of tears brought to my eyes, and yeah, wasn't actually the lowest as far as I'd go for Brian Nigel matches. It was definitely better than the Glory by Honor match, and yeah, Nigel looked great, and I love the fact that it wasn't just a bog standard 50-50 wrestling match, and Nigel told the story of being the commentator coming back. Brilliant stuff. So yeah, Dynamite was great. It was then followed by Collision, which we'd seen some spoiler of as to what was coming in there. I know Steph tried to prep people for the MXM segment and how rough that was going to be. Hangman and Jeff, which was kind of the thing we were thinking, we'll spend a lot of time talking about Collision on a Spotlight this week, because they've saved that for Collision. Fuck me, if that had been on Dynamite, I might have had some different takes on it. But the Ospreay Ricochet sit-down stuff was good, and then a real mixed bag outside of it on Grand Slam Collision this week. Thoughts, JP?
We went from quite consequential, a really, like I say, a really strong Dynamite with very heavy on the wrestling, to a lot of this that was incredibly throwaway. I thought I never once kind of got into the show. There was stuff on here for the sake of it. The MXM,
very, very taped, wasn't it? Very, very taped.
That's it. It just felt incredible. It just felt like a taped AEW show, and I think a taped AEW show at this point. That's why I didn't watch Rampage. I was like, this was taped a week before, and it's going to seem even deader now than it would do then, particularly because we've seen the Grand Slam show. But this one felt like, and maybe I got the impression this will be the one where people were leaving. They're like, right, we've seen Dynamite. Do we need to see this on Collision? Nope. Let's beat that New York traffic. That would have been the mentality I would have had like a show like this, because a lot of it was like it was throwaway. It really was. It was like, yeah, it had on the thing on the weekend shows. I didn't know the spoilers. I'd gone out of my way not to know the spoilers, but I thought, okay, there's things on here that potentially could be good, that are like, you know, that feel like there's some different people appearing on Collision than what usually would do. And then when I watched it, I was like, I very much got that feeling that I've had watching Collision in the last couple of weeks of, do I really need to see this? And I think I brought up the point last time about it being kind of like placeholder TV. And it still made me think this was a placeholder show as part of a much bigger show that was on the Wednesday. So, yeah,
I liked Ian Riccaboni being on commentary. That was a positive for me. That made me think, when they move forward, if they move off Saturdays, becomes a Thursday show. He didn't want to give us weekends off for AEW. I think he'll give up his Thursdays, as we've seen with ROH. Maybe that could be a more permanent fixture. Although I thought he was good overall in the show, I didn't think he was great during the MXM stuff, which was rotten. Which was that's got to be up there for one of the worst segments of the year, as far as like what I don't want out of AEW, which is, you know, WWE adjacent bad comedy with Billy Gunn's wearing a mask. So isn't it a great reveal when we reveal that it's this very obviously built like Billy Gunn man is Billy Gunn? Never mind the fact it took them 20 minutes to get there. With like, if I was there, some of those intros to some of those guys and some of those terrible in jokes that just didn't land, like I'd have chopped all of that out of the final air in a Collision. To be honest, I might have chopped the entire segment out. I'm surprised that that aired as planned.
Very, very much what looked like, you and won't appreciate me saying this, but when TNA would try and impersonate WWE, this came across to me as when TNA try and pardon me, when AEW try and impersonate WWE in sports entertainment, and it just comes across badly, and that's what this was like.
Yeah, I thought Hangman Jeff again just wasn't the way I would present Hangman Page. Overall, he kind of kept a you know, consistent with who he is, but like some of the stuff with the straps where he's like running around, like running away from, again, I don't think I understood what this match was going to be. I just thought lumberjack match, but lumberjacks with straps just kind of illuminated the weirdness of the, I suppose, the dynamics of the characters here. I'm watching it going, this match is literally an example of who is the babyface and who is the heel in AEW, because like you forget Jeff's the babyface, but Jeff's got all of these heels on his side. Hangman's kind of a heel based on his act, but he's a bit of a tweener, and then he's spending the last 5 minutes of the match running away from these mid-card jobber heels with straps who apparently he's angered. Like, I don't remember what's going on between him and the Gun Club, but apparently that's a thread I should be following. We're going back to law with fucking this, you know, with Evil Uno and the Dark Order there as well. It just made me think, as much as I maybe almost ironically, or maybe just as a loop that needed to be closed, kind of wanted to see Jeff and Hangman go at it one more time. Now I just want to see Hangman move on to just more main event things with other people who aren't maybe Swerve, but I don't really know what that avenue is.
What I wanted here was a vicious blood feud, and what I got here was a lot of bollocks, a lot of nonsense being thrown in, and Karen Jarrett diving into the ring, and you know, stuff going on at ringside with just like what the Gun Club were wearing and the Dark Order, and it was just like a whole series of very lower level characters, and it seemed to be ultimately where the place I want to go to is what they're doing next week, which is Juice Robinson versus Hangman Page. And don't get me wrong, Juice Robinson in AEW has been a surprisingly like fun act, but this was just like, is this the way to get there? Is this the way they're going to be introducing Jay White into the mix as a bit of a placeholder feud for Hangman? I was like, okay, but then even Jay White is a babyface in AEW, I'm not really convinced by. So yeah, it was a lot worse than what I thought it would be. I'd higher hopes for this.
So yeah, that was set up for Dynamite this week again. As much as I didn't love Collision, Dynamite was one of the great shows of the year. I expect the follow-up Dynamite to be strong as well. 5-year anniversary Dynamite. We got Will Ospreay versus Ricochet set up, which I'd sat down and watched the full YouTube version of their sit down rather than the spliced clips that we got on Collision. Again, I feel like the talking in this feud has been actually better than at least Ricochet's wrestling. Definitely not Ospreay's, who continues to have ridiculous match of the year contenders after match of the year contenders. Again, speaking of that tag match last week, but yeah, I enjoyed that sit down. I love the personal needle of it. Anybody who followed both of their careers, or even just followed them both on Twitter, saw that personal needle between them. You know, there's like a bit of ribbon, a bit of like big brothering. You know, Ricochet was the big brother. Will Ospreay was very affirmatively the little brother. They've clearly made that part of the story now, with Will Ospreay as the big brother and Ricochet as the kind of being forced to be little brother when he really doesn't want to. A lot of shots from Ospreay that I'm sure Matty didn't like about being out of the business for the last 6 years. So I think that's the personal side that's been really set up. Whether Ricochet can deliver in the match, I'm not sure, but I think they've maybe taught me into it on Dynamite this week. And yeah, Britt Baker coming back against Serena Deebs on that show too. I expect they'll stack it with even more. But yeah, what's your interest level on Ospreay Ricochet now?
I enjoyed this. I actually wanted to see more of it. My thought was actually I would love to have seen this go on for longer, and you can get rid of that pointless Brody King and Action Andretti match that nobody had fucking asked for, and a bit more of this. I would have liked. In the main, when they do sit down interviews, I find them just a lot more interesting. And here it flowed as like a natural conversation, because it wasn't like your orthodox pro wrestling people shouting at each other. There was like kind of fair points. I wanted a video package to go alongside it to show the clip from New Japan, or even the other, matches that they've had around the world as well. I thought there's other stuff that they could have expanded on with this to even take it further. And that's not a slight on the segment. I thought it was good. I'm more enthusiastic about seeing it after the sit-down interview than what I was. But like you say, my reservation is, what kind of Ricochet are we going to see on Wednesday? Is it one who's going to go, right, I'm going to go out all guns blazing, and they're just going to go at 1,000,000 miles an hour? Because that's the way I think that match should go. I don't want to see any stalling style bullshit, or let's slow it down
stuff that you get.
Nope. None of that.
It's one of them. It's Ricochet's 3.25 batting average back in AEW versus Will Ospreay's very affirmatively 4.5 stars and above batting average this year in AEW. I think it's going to be more like that. If Ospreay's on any form whatsoever, I think we're going to get a great match. So yeah, maybe I shouldn't be too worried. But yeah, that's coming up this week for Dynamite. As far as WWE goes, outside of the documentary coming out, which is very much about as much about them as Vince when it comes to the Janel Grant story. Not a huge amount of news. Charlotte Flair's apparently not cleared. That was an update that we have. That's about it, really. Though all quite on Western front, unless you've caught up on any SmackDown from the weekend.
I haven't caught up on any SmackDown at all. I think it was just like the Vince McMahon documentary. Colour you shocked. The Vince McMahon documentary was the one that kind of took precedence for making sure that I'd watched it and paid the requisite amount of attention to it as well. But no, didn't see that. But I think in many ways their news cycle is going to be really the ramifications of what comes out of the documentary as well. So they're in their kind of pattern. We spoke about it on the weekend show, the 2-night SummerSlam that they're doing in New Jersey. That was felt like that was their big story, the kind of continued commercial successes and everything else that they're doing in between. So was it any good? SmackDown, was it something to
no
anything happen?
Owens and Cody Rhodes went face to face at the end of the show, as we continue to tease who's going to turn out of Kevin Owens, Randy Orton, and Cody Rhodes. It's not going to be Cody Rhodes. More bloodline stuff without Roman Reigns. So all those weeks SmackDowns kind of go. Got to see Andrade and LA Knight have more awkward interactions. Outside of that, very skippable SmackDown. Expecting more to come out of Raw tomorrow night, obviously with Punk and Drew being added to that, and that will be the true final build to the pay-per-view at the weekend. Bad Blood, which by the way seems to be sticking with 5 matches, which is extreme. Like I was convinced Gunther and Sami Zayn was going to get added to that, but apparently Triple H is fucking just determined to do only 5 matches and no more. And it looks like that match is going to be on the Saudi show, which is another WWE pay-per-view coming up later in the next month. So yeah, you got that to look forward to, JP. But yeah, it looks like that's what they're building that for, and not Bad Blood as a lot probably thought.
I mean, at least they're easy watches, 5 match cards. And there's a lot of stuff that I can skip through when I end up watching it on delay. and I can go, yep, here we go. We've got video packages for the next 25 minutes. I can skip through that and makes it easier for me. But yeah, he's determined by this. And I think that's the pattern that he's got set up, which is the 7 or 8 matches. Pardon me, my voice is going completely here. I've turned into the fellas sat behind me, but that frog voice appears to be incredibly contagious. It's around the same point that the microphone went to hell as well. Like, bloody hell. But yeah, I think, 5, it's this absolute hesitance to not give anything away or not give too much, which sometimes can be appreciated, but 5 matches will always feel far too small.
I'd be fine with 6. It's just that slight difference. It's like AEW. I'd be fine with just maybe 1 or 2 less. I'm not necessarily saying they should be doing 5 match cards, 6 match cards either, but yeah, a little bit more. Although, 11 p.m. start time for Bad Blood. We'll be talking that a lot on the weekend show. I'm sure even if he's not on the full show, we'll have Matty for the preview of that. But that's pretty much everything outside of this gigantic documentary that's going on in Fedland. But yeah, outside of that, obviously New Japan Destruction in Kobe did take place this weekend. We have a little bit more on the Royal Quest card. Shota Umino versus Callum Newman has now been added to Zack Sabre Jr. versus Sanada and TMDK versus Tanahashi and Ishii. Any more interesting than that coverage? I'd go. I think if they just give me 1 match that makes me want to get on the train, because I can't. Rev Pro looks so much better on the Saturday, and I imagine will be so much better in the Donny Dome. But as I said on the weekend show, I'm otherwise engaged on the Saturday. Otherwise, I'd make the trip on the Sunday, if anything, for podcast content for us to talk about it. But yeah, not that too hyped on it on Royal Quest, and I don't know if you saw any Destruction in Kobe, but the results to that didn't necessarily make me very hyped about Monday New Japan either.
Do you know, I thought to myself, I should see some of it. We're recording tonight on it. I saw a lot of the results and I was like, do I need to see Shingo becoming the 5-time never openweight champion? Not really. It's another match he had with Hanare. I'm sure it was Hoss fight and the rest of it. Okay, that's fine. But the rest of it was going through the motions, because King of Pro Wrestling next weekend, that's the bigger show. That's the one that's like, it's got Zack versus Naito, where you could genuinely have title change. I think the only other thing that kind of happened was basically Rohei Oila turning up for TMDK, which I think I said in the weekend show was seen to be the likely outcome. He'd had that excursion in Noah, and now he's back there as well. But very much going through the motions, which is not a position. Again, I can only stress enough. It's not a position that they should be in. They should be putting their best foot forward with all of the younger talent and all of the stuff the good stuff they did in the G1, because that was one of the things we said. We did dip in and out of the G1. It's actually, there is some decent stuff in here. There are people who've shown levels of improvement, and you just look at a card like this, and it's just like booking by numbers. And they need to stop that. They're not in the position, and they haven't got, I don't think they've got the level of necessarily goodwill, but they've got to start thinking about the future. And it appears to be like putting on cards like this. They're just sort of like a waste of a card. Even if it was someone outside of like Great O'Khan challenging for the title, just someone different that might well have had a bit more interest there. But instead, I looked at the results and I was like, do I need to see this? Do I need to sit through what's... No. And that's... do you know what? That almost inevitably is the answer to all, do I need to see this New Japan show? And Royal Quest is the same. It's just like a going through the motions. As soon as they put Zack in with Sanada, you're like, okay, so this is the guy who... This could be for the IWGP title. This would be the thing you'd expect to headline. And it's Sanada. Why? Because of that linear thinking that says, well, Sanada was in LIJ... I'm sure he probably pinned him in the G1, which I can't remember, and I can't be asked to check up if that is the case. So we have to have this match. And it's like, you don't have to have this match. You could put on some fucking exciting matches, but there we go.
Good lesson for any promoter. I believe Red Pro was good today though from Sheffield, and obviously they had the J Cup yesterday with Leo Rush winning. So looking forward to counting up on that, catching up on that. Mike DiVecchio apparently impressed man. Today was at the show with the Ogdens. Hope they all had a good day. I'll make it to one of them Sheffield Rev Pro shows at some point. Yeah, Zack v Robbie X is the match they set up for the Donny Dome on the Rev Pro side. See, that's already more interesting.
Robbie X isn't winning. That much I can tell you.
To be fair, actually, the result isn't that interesting because Robbie X doesn't win. But outside of that, yeah.
But I mean, I'm glad it seemed to be a decent crowd they had in Stevenage for the British J Cup as well. I suppose, you know, while I might not be necessarily excited by Lio Rush winning, I can see the logic. He's a guy you're more likely to be able to book to come in and have matches in and around the cruiserweight divisions and, you know, potentially beat and everything else. So I can see the logic in him winning it, you know, as opposed to, say, Barbario, Cannavario. I mean, how many times are you likely to be able to get him in there for the long haul as well? But I'm just hoping in terms of the crowds that it picked up. I don't know what they did at the Sheffield show today. I'll be intrigued to know. And I'll be intrigued to know how many they get in for the Donny Dome as well, because that's quite a big venue. Like, you can fit near a couple of thousand in there, can't you? So, like, it'll be interesting to see.
Whereas wrestling promoters did, somehow. So,
yeah.
You know, imagine.
Well, they need Abyss, don't they? He would have been the man to sell it. Him and Steve Corino.
Sterling James Keenan. I don't think he's got anything else to do. I haven't heard from him in years. Weird. Maybe because of the commentary. Anywho, but yeah, if I could go, I would. Wish I could, but that's all going on as well. But yeah, anything else to mention, JP, watching wise? I know you've been working your way through Dump at SHOWNOTES series, and you'll be chatting that with Karen. Hopefully, we'll get Karen back on here at some point soon.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, anything else to reference?
I think, you know, I'm going to be recording with Karen this weekend, and we're going to be talking about Queen of Villains. So I'm really looking forward to that. She's actually, if you go to Post Wrestling, and she does her is it a Dream Slam quarterly? She does like a sort of a newsletter, sort of rounding up a lot of coverage going on in Japan at the moment. She actually puts down some specific matches with links. The Dump Matsumoto, if you want to go back and watch some of those as well. So I want to finish off the series. I'm like basically like halfway through at this point. I've, you know, in terms of, it's a different level of expectations what we would have had with the Mr. McMahon documentary, but there still is that Netflix sheen to it, which has to be said. Actually, there is ways of filming wrestling that is very, very interesting that Netflix are managing to do, and it's getting good reviews. Like, I think, you know, this is something that is, I'll talk about it when I speak about it with Karen as well. And then hopefully we'll get her over and we'll kind of elaborate on what we've done on there. Whether or not you'll watch it, Benno, that'll always be the test for me. But I think actually you'd be pleasantly surprised by just how kind of easy and watchable this is as a show. It's good fun. And it's made in a way where, like, in terms of the acting as well, even if the actor who's playing Chigusa Nagoya looks nothing like her, and it's hard to remove her from, like, sort of gayer girls and everything else. But I think, honestly, it is, like, it's a lot of fun. And again, All Japan Women isn't something that I'm necessarily familiar with, but I'm certainly intrigued and looking back on it, particularly in terms of the characterization and how women wrestlers were treated around that point in time. There's a lot of really interesting tidbits in terms of looking at the psyche of Japanese wrestling and how bookers think and promote and stuff like that. So yeah, really looking forward to that.
Brilliant. Yeah, Ewan references maybe making it his dealer's choice on the Crush Cars. So it could be an excuse to watch it all. Maybe after I've finished. I haven't started Penguin yet, so maybe it'll come after that. But
episode 2 tonight of that, mate. So
yeah,
I'd say that's if you need a break from Randall, Keith, Orton, and I'm assuming you will do. I know I will. But Penguin, I'm really looking forward to the second episode of that.
Well, speaking of Randy Orton, as we close out, plenty going on over on the Patreon, and for YouTube members, Dealers Choice Month, we'll be wrapping up there this week with Matty's show, which is just going to make it over the finish line. We'll be recording it on Tuesday. We're counting it as still October. It's still good. But yeah, obviously you can get everything we've recorded so far, from my Nigel show to the Bam Bam Bigelow show to way back in the olden times when we did the Bryan Danielson show with Gareth, plus all of our pre-shows, which actually the audio of is available to patrons of any level. Even if you want to join for free, you will get at least those pre-shows over on audio on Patreon. It's like a bit of a whistle wetter for the main Dealer's Choice shows. So check those out if you haven't already. You can get the Richard Benson pre-show, which was the Benno Soprano show. Yours was Crime Watch themed. We've had some fun on these pre-shows this month, and all of the Dealer's Choice shows have been live. So yeah, we'll be keeping that up one more time time for Matty's show on Tuesday. So yeah, don't do the Randy homework, but listen to us having suffered through the Randy homework, and I think it'll make for a cracking podcast is what I'd recommend people. Although I have seen from the Discord some of the sickos have already started on that Randy Orton playlist. So yeah, hats off to you folks. It's not even your job, and you do it.
I think it's brilliant stuff on there. And you mentioned earlier, even when we were talking about very briefly WBF, if you go back into the archive of stuff we covered the WBF and the WBF show as well. So you want to hear our thoughts on that and possibly the indie world of bodybuilding as well as skinny lads flexing in front of hoops. Yeah,
plenty of it in its own section. So yeah. Lots to get into there, but yeah, that's the Patreon. That's everything going on. But yeah, unless there's anything else to plug, obviously get your merch at Chop Tees. The Big Cartel sale is ongoing. But yeah, outside of that, Matty show Tuesday, weekend show will be Thursday. We'll be talking the AEW TV deal, and then yeah, back again for Spotlight on Sunday. But with all that said, thank you, patrons, for tuning in. Thank you to our live patrons and to our live YouTube members who've joined us through the night. Thank you to our special guest, Will Cooling. I thought it was fantastic tonight. Shoot him a follow and listen wherever he next puts a podcast out. But as always, thank you to our Kings of the Mountain, Conor Loughlin, Eddie Sarbanes, Chris Platt, Ewan Cameron, and Carl Gack. We will catch you again on the next one.
Bye.
Good night, all.